Hey everyone, welcome to Nightmare Scene. Before we begin, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from as you hear these spine-chilling stories? Leave a comment to let me know. Alright, now take a deep breath. Let's begin. I have been planning this solo trip for weeks. The remote cabin in the mountains, far from civilization, seemed like the perfect place to disconnect. A place to escape the noise, the crowds, and the demands of everyday life. It was a small, rustic cabin, just large enough for one person, with a wood-burning stove, a bed, and a few basic amenities. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just me, the mountains, and the snow. The drive up was beautiful, if not a bit nerve-wracking. The further I got from the nearest town, the fewer cars I saw on the road. The snow began to fall lightly as I passed the last sign of civilization, and by the time I reached the cabin, it was coming down in thick, heavy sheets. The world outside seemed to vanish behind a curtain of white, leaving me in a still, almost eerie silence. The cabin itself was just as I imagined it, cozy, quiet, and completely isolated. I unpacked my things, stoked the fire, and made a cup of tea. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, the wind howling against the windows, rattling the panes with each gust. I smiled to myself. This was exactly what I wanted. I spent the evening reading by the fire, listening to the wind, and occasionally watching the snow pile up outside. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. It wasn't a feeling of imminent danger, but a strange unease that crept up my spine, like a subtle pressure in the air. At first, I attributed it to the isolation. After all, it wasn't uncommon for people to feel a bit disoriented in such extreme solitude, especially when the weather outside was so intense. But then it started. The knocking. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind and the crackling of the fire. It sounded like a tap, tap, tap coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind or a branch hitting the window, but it kept happening in a pattern almost rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Tap, tap, tap again. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window, peering out into the blizzard. The snow was falling so thickly that I could barely make out the trees a few feet away. I didn't see anyone. No tracks in the snow. No movement. The landscape was a blank white canvas, undisturbed and still. The knocking had stopped. I shrugged it off. The wind was strong, and the trees outside were probably swaying, causing branches to knock against the walls. I tried to settle back into my chair, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the hours passed, the storm worsened. The wind outside screamed like a living thing, and the temperature dropped drastically. I could hear the walls creaking, the floorboards groaning under the pressure of the wind. And then there it was again. A knock. But this time it was louder, more insistent. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked to the door. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek outside. The blizzard had intensified, and the wind whipped snow into my face. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The world outside was an impenetrable wall of white. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. What the hell was going on? There was no one out there. No one could have made it out in this weather, not in this blizzard. It was too dangerous. I tried to push the thought from my mind and returned to my seat by the fire, trying to focus on my book. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like invisible eyes boring into the back of my neck. I couldn't explain it, but every shadow in the room seemed to stretch just a little longer than it should. Every creak of the cabin sounded more deliberate, more purposeful. Then, just as I was about to get up to check the door again, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. The fire was still crackling, but the room was cold, the warmth from the stove no longer enough to ward off the chill that had settled into my bones. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I turned it on and scanned the room. That's when I saw it. The window. There, on the frosted glass, was a handprint, clear as day. A handprint as if someone had pressed their palm against the window from the outside, leaving a dark smear against the white frost. I froze. I couldn't breathe. The handprint was too distinct, too real. There was no way it could have been there before. I hadn't noticed it when I checked earlier. Panic set in. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my thoughts raced in 100 different directions. Was someone out there? Had someone been watching me? Had they somehow gotten inside? I couldn't tell. The snowstorm outside made everything seem distorted, unreal. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Nothing. The cabin had no landline, and the storm had made sure that no one could reach me. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure they were all locked. Everything was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. Hours passed, but the storm didn't let up. The wind howled like an animal, the snow piling up against the cabin. I stayed by the fire, keeping a tight grip on the flashlight, too afraid to sleep. I kept hearing things, distant footsteps in the snow, a faint tapping at the door, the sound of something shifting outside, just out of sight. But every time I checked, there was nothing. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the fire, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Eventually, the storm began to subside, the wind dying down, the snow slowing to a soft flurry. When morning finally came, the blizzard had passed. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light through the frosted windows. I stepped outside cautiously to survey the damage. There were no tracks in the snow, no sign of anyone, just the quiet, empty wilderness. But the handprint on the window, it still lingered as if someone had been right there watching me all night. I left the cabin that day, unable to shake the feeling that I had been alone, but not truly alone. Something had been out there, and it knew I was there. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just the two of us escaping the chaos of city life. My boyfriend, Tom, and I had booked a small cottage in a remote village far from the crowded streets and endless noise. The village was known for its quiet atmosphere, surrounded by rolling hills and deep forests. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind and reconnect. We drove for hours, passing through winding roads and empty fields, before finally arriving at the village. The streets were narrow and winding, lined with old stone cottages that looked like they hadn't seen a human being in decades. The air felt thick, as if the village had been frozen in time. There were no shops, no signs of life, just the eerie silence that seemed to settle over everything. Our cottage was at the far end of the village, perched on a small hill. It was an old building weathered by time, with ivy creeping up its stone walls. The wooden door creaked loudly as we entered, and the musty smell of old furniture and dust filled the air. It had character, but it was far from welcoming. Still, we were here to relax, so we tried to brush off the feeling of unease and settled in for the night. As evening fell, a thick fog rolled in, making everything beyond the window look like a blurred, gray mass. The fog wrapped around the cottage, swallowing the village whole. It was almost as if the fog had its own mind, creeping in from the hills, blanketing the village in a cold embrace. I shivered, but Tom said it was just the weather, that the fog would lift by morning. We spent the evening inside, cooking dinner and talking, but the sense of isolation continued to gnaw at me. It was so quiet, too quiet. Even the usual sounds of nature were muted by the fog. The occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of a breeze felt out of place in this strange, dead silence. After dinner, we decided to take a walk through the village. It was already dark, and the fog was so thick that we could barely see more than a few feet in front of us. The lantern we carried flickered dimly, casting long, ghostly shadows on the stone buildings. We wandered down the narrow streets, our footsteps the only sound that broke the stillness. At first, everything seemed fine. But then, as we passed a dilapidated house on the corner, I felt it. Something was watching us. I stopped in my tracks, looking around, but there was no one. No movement, no sound, just the dense fog that surrounded us. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, we were in a quiet village, surrounded by nothing but empty homes. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Tom didn't seem to notice. He was more focused on the old houses, which were slowly decaying under the weight of years of neglect. We continued walking, turning down a side street that led deeper into the village. That's when we saw it. There was a house at the end of the street, tall, dark, and completely out of place compared to the others. It had a strange, unnatural look to it, like it had been built in a hurry, with mismatched materials that didn't seem to belong. The windows were all boarded up, and the door was slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry. I didn't want to go any closer, but Tom, ever the curious one, insisted we investigate. Maybe there's someone inside, he suggested, his voice almost too eager. Against my better judgment, I followed him toward the house. As we reached the front door, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The fog was thicker here, the air still and heavy. I could barely hear anything except the sound of our breathing and the distant creaking of old wood. Tom pushed the door open and we stepped inside. The house was dark and musty, with the smell of rot filling the air. The floorboards creaked under our feet as we explored, our flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. There was nothing in the living room but dust and broken furniture. But then, in the corner, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Wet footprints, leading toward the back of the house. I didn't want to follow them, but Tom was already moving forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. I hesitated, but then I heard it. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, coming from the back room. My heart started to race. "Tom," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We should go." But Tom didn't hear me. He was already opening the door to the back room. I followed reluctantly, my hand trembling as I gripped the flashlight. As the door creaked open, a rush of cold air hit us. The room was empty, except for a strange, unsettling sound. It was a low, almost guttural groan coming from the floor. I couldn't make sense of it. We stood frozen for a moment, straining our ears to listen. The groan sounded again, followed by a rustling noise. I shined the flashlight on the floor, and that's when I saw it. A pile of old clothes, tangled together as if someone had left in a hurry. But beneath them, something was moving. Tom stepped closer, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could react, the door slammed shut behind us with a loud bang, trapping us inside. Panic surged through me as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. We were locked in. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice shaking. But there was no answer. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer and closer until I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. In a frantic panic, we ran toward the window, but it was sealed shut. The fog outside seemed to press against the glass, blocking any escape. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was here with us? Just as I thought I could take no more, the door to the house opened, revealing nothing but darkness outside. The fog had rolled in thicker than ever, and the village was silent. We didn't wait to see who or what had opened the door. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached our cottage, slamming the door behind us and locking it. The next morning, the village was as still as before, the fog now dissipating and the streets empty. When we tried to tell the locals about what had happened, they simply smiled, too wide, too knowingly. The village was abandoned, they told us. Had been for years. But we knew what we had seen. Something, or someone, was still there. I thought I was prepared for a peaceful solo retreat by the lake. A week away from the chaos of everyday life, surrounded by nature, on a small island that could only be accessed by boat. My plan was simple: to clear my head, to enjoy the serenity of the water, the chirping of birds, and the rustling of trees. Just me in the wilderness. No distractions, no one to bother me. The boat ride to the island was short but beautiful, cutting through the glassy surface of the lake as I made my way toward the small, secluded patch of land. The island was tiny, just large enough for a small cabin, a few trails, and a scattering of trees. It seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, with a rustic charm. It had everything I needed: a wood stove, a bed, and even a small kitchen. The peacefulness of the place was overwhelming, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as I unloaded my bags. The weather was perfect that first day. Clear skies, warm sun, and a light breeze that made the trees sway gently. I spent the afternoon reading, walking along the water's edge, and even attempting a small swim. The only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish jumping, the hum of insects, and the faint rustling of leaves. It felt like I had stepped into another world, a world where nothing could go wrong. As evening approached, I stoked the fire in the cabin and settled in for a quiet dinner. The night was calm, and the lake shimmered under the moonlight. I ate, cleaned up, and prepared to settle in for the night. That's when the first strange thing happened. I heard a faint sound from outside, a soft rustling, almost like someone walking through the trees. I shrugged it off. Could have been an animal, a bird, or even the wind playing tricks. I didn't let it bother me. But then, as I was lying in bed trying to drift off to sleep, the sound returned. This time it was more distinct. A footstep, followed by a second one, then a third. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside the cabin, right near the window. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed and turned it on, scanning the dark yard. There was nothing. No movement, no figures in the shadows. I opened the window slightly and called out, thinking maybe it was a camper from another part of the island. But there was no answer, just the sound of the lake's gentle ripples and the occasional creak of the trees. I closed the window, my nerves still on edge. The cabin was locked and the door was bolted. I wasn't sure why I felt so uneasy. It was probably nothing, just my imagination getting the best of me. I tried to get some sleep, but it wasn't easy. Every small noise seemed amplified in the silence of the island. The next morning, I decided to explore the island more thoroughly. I figured the best way to calm my nerves was to stretch my legs and take in more of the natural beauty that surrounded me. I walked along the shoreline, enjoying the tranquility, and eventually made my way to the far side of the island, where a dense patch of woods grew. The trees were thick and the underbrush was dense, but I pressed on. The farther I walked, the more isolated I felt. There was no sign of anyone else, no other boats on the lake, no footprints in the dirt. Just me in the wilderness. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A small clearing with a pile of old, weathered wooden planks scattered on the ground. It was out of place, as if someone had built something here long ago and then abandoned it. I knelt down to inspect the planks. They seemed to form the remains of a structure, maybe a small shack or shelter that had long since fallen apart. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another relic of the past. But as I stood up to leave, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the dirt leading away from the clearing. They were fresh. I froze. The footprints were clear, sharp in the mud, but there was something unsettling about them. They weren't animal tracks, they were human, and they were leading deeper into the woods. I stood there, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone could have been on the island, at least not without me knowing. My boat was the only one on the shore. I turned around, scanning the woods for any sign of movement, but the place was eerily still. I walked back toward the cabin, my mind racing with questions. Who else was on this island? Why hadn't I seen anyone? As I reached the cabin, the feeling of unease deepened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig made my heart race. That night, I stayed up late, sitting by the fire, waiting for any sign that I wasn't alone. The wind outside howled louder than before, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. I kept the lights low, the doors and windows locked, and my phone close by, though there was no signal on the island. The silence felt oppressive, like it was swallowing everything whole. Around midnight, I heard it again. A soft tap at the window, the same as before. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up quickly, my heart in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window, pulling aside the curtain just a little. The beam of light illuminated the area outside, but there was no one, no movement, nothing at all. I opened the door, stepped outside, and shouted into the night. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. The wind howled in the trees, but there was no answer. I stepped back inside, my heart racing. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. But then the door creaked shut behind me, slowly. I hadn't touched it. I spun around, but there was no one in the cabin with me. Panic set in, and I began to check every corner, every shadowed space. I even looked under the bed and behind the curtains, but it was empty. Everything was locked up tight. The morning light brought little comfort. The fog that had rolled in during the night hadn't lifted, and the world outside was still muted, distant. When I checked the shoreline, my boat was still there, undisturbed, but the footprints from the previous day were gone, as if they had never existed. I stayed in the cabin for the rest of the day, too afraid to venture far. The fear of not knowing who or what was on the island with me gnawed at me. By the time the evening came, I had packed my things and was ready to leave. I didn't care about the retreat anymore. I needed to get away from that place. As I made my way back to the dock, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The fog was thicker now, almost suffocating. And there, just for a second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window. I didn't wait to confirm. I got in the boat, started the engine, and sped away. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that island. The footprints, the tapping at the window, the door that closed by itself. But one thing is for sure, I'll never return to that lake. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, alone, on an island that was anything but empty. I had always prided myself on being independent. I loved the quiet, the solitude, and the freedom that came with being alone in the wilderness. So when I decided to hike through the remote forests of northern Canada, I expected nothing more than a peaceful and solitary experience. What I didn't expect was to find myself running for my life through a snow-covered forest, chased by someone or something I couldn't see but could feel closing in on me every second. It all began 2 days into my hike, after I had set up camp in a small clearing near a frozen river. The weather was harsh, typical for this time of year, but I had come prepared. Thick layers of clothing, a solid tent, and enough supplies to last me the entire week. The first day had been uneventful, just me, the snow, and the howling wind. I had even spent some time sitting by the fire, reading my book and listening to the sounds of nature. But on the second night, things took a strange turn. As I lay in my tent, trying to fall asleep to the sound of the wind outside, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint crunching sound, like boots pressing into the snow, coming from outside my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I had seen no sign of any other hikers or campers on the trail. The thought of someone else being out here in this desolate place was unsettling. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I waited for the sound to stop, but it didn't. It continued, getting closer to my tent. Slowly, the panic began to creep in. I told myself it was just an animal, a moose maybe, or a bear. I knew I shouldn't be afraid. But then I heard something else. Voices, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tightly in my trembling hands, and unzipped the door of the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the snow-covered ground. But there was no one there. No footprints, no tracks, nothing. The snow was undisturbed. It was as if whatever had been out there had simply vanished. Shaking, I crawled back into my sleeping bag, telling myself that I was just imagining things. The wilderness could play tricks on your mind. But sleep didn't come easy that night. The sounds of footsteps, of voices, kept replaying in my mind. The next morning, I packed up my camp and decided to continue my hike. I couldn't afford to waste time, and I wanted to put the strange incident behind me. But as I started walking, I noticed something unsettling: fresh footprints in the snow. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes scanning the ground. The footprints were large, deep, like the person who made them was wearing heavy boots. The prints were spaced wide apart, indicating that whoever was out there was walking at a fast pace. I followed the tracks for a while, hoping to find some clue as to who they belonged to. But the trail led deeper into the forest, winding through trees and up and down slopes. Eventually, I reached a point where the tracks seemed to disappear, swallowed by the vast expanse of snow. My heart began to pound. How could this person just vanish? There were no other signs of movement in the area. No branches broken, no trees disturbed, nothing. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The wind had picked up, and the snow was beginning to fall again, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I turned around to head back to my camp, but the feeling of being watched, the oppressive sense of something looming nearby, was growing stronger. By late afternoon, the storm had intensified. The wind was howling through the trees, and snow was blowing so heavily that it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I knew I needed to find shelter before it got worse. I started moving quickly, my mind focused on getting back to my tent. But as I pushed through the snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I heard it again, the crunch of snow, but this time it was much closer. It was unmistakable. Someone was following me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched in my throat as I spun around, my heart racing. There was nothing there. The forest was silent, save for the wind and the swirling snow. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate crunch, as though someone was stepping exactly where I had just stepped. I broke into a run. The adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted through the snow, the cold air burning my lungs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, but I refused to stop. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my body growing colder and colder. The snowstorm had become a blinding blur, and I could barely make out the shape of the trees around me. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing, my mind foggy from exhaustion and panic. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The storm was so thick that I could barely see anything. The wind howled and the snow bit at my skin, but I didn't care. I was too tired, too scared. That's when I heard it. A voice, quiet but clear. "You can't run forever." My blood ran cold. I didn't dare move. The voice wasn't coming from the wind, it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from behind me. I could feel the presence there, a shadow lurking just out of sight. I didn't wait to see who it was. I scrambled to my feet and started running again, my legs numb from the cold. I ran until I couldn't feel my feet anymore, until the world around me became nothing but snow and darkness. By some miracle, I stumbled upon another hiker's camp just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion. They took me in, gave me food, and got me out of the storm. But that night, as I sat by their fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man, whoever he was, had been real. The next day, I reported the incident to the authorities. They told me no one had been in the area for weeks and no one had ever gone missing. But I knew what I had felt. I knew that someone had been following me, and I knew that I wasn't just being paranoid. I never went back to that wilderness. And to this day, I still hear that voice in the back of my mind, whispering through the snow, "You can't run forever." It was supposed to be a routine drive, just a few hours on an empty stretch of highway, cutting through the vast open plains of the American Midwest. I had been on road trips before, but this time I was on my own, driving to visit an old friend in a small town I hadn't been to in years. The route was familiar, and I'd made the trip countless times in the past. But this time, something felt off from the very beginning. I left my apartment in the late afternoon, hoping to arrive just before dark. The sky was a muted shade of blue, and the wind was picking up, making the long, flat road feel even more isolating. The radio was my only company, playing soft rock songs from the 80s, and I found myself drifting in and out of thought, the miles ticking by as I drove on autopilot. After about 2 hours, I hit a section of the highway where the road stretched for miles without a single turn or intersection. This was the kind of stretch that made you feel like you were driving through nothingness, just endless fields and the occasional dilapidated farmhouse in the distance. There were no cars in sight ahead or behind me, and the sense of solitude was both calming and unnerving. That's when I noticed something strange. It started with the headlights. From far behind me, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, faint at first but growing larger as the car drew closer. I paid no attention at first. After all, this stretch of highway was known for its long gaps between traffic. But then the car passed me, too closely. It swerved in front of me, almost grazing my bumper, and continued speeding ahead without any sign of slowing down. I couldn't explain why, but something about that felt wrong. The car had appeared out of nowhere, like it had been waiting in the shadows. It was a black sedan, no visible markings, no license plate that I could make out in the fading light. I could only see the shape of it in my rearview mirror as it tore ahead. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably nothing more than another driver passing through, just like me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was being followed. I tried to ignore it. I turned up the radio to drown out my thoughts, focusing on the steady hum of the engine, the rhythm of the road beneath me. The sensation of being watched didn't go away though. As I passed mile markers and signs that indicated I was getting closer to my destination, I noticed the car was still there. Just ahead, its taillights glowing in the distance. A few more miles passed and then I saw it again. The black sedan, this time in my rearview mirror, was coming up behind me. It was speeding up, closing the gap between us in a way that didn't seem natural. The highway was empty, and there was no reason for the driver to be tailgating me. I accelerated, trying to put some distance between us, but the sedan kept pace. It was as though the driver was deliberately staying behind me, just far enough to stay out of sight but close enough to unsettle me. The headlights grew brighter and I could feel my heart rate increasing. The road ahead stretched endlessly, and with each passing second, the feeling of unease grew heavier. I made a decision to pull off at the next rest stop. I needed a break, something to calm my nerves. The rest stop came into view, a lonely place with a dimly lit sign and an empty parking lot. I pulled in, parked near the far end, and turned off the engine, trying to steady my breathing. I watched the rearview mirror, waiting for the black sedan to pass by. It was my only way out, but the sedan didn't pass. Instead, it slowed down as it approached the entrance of the rest stop. My heart stopped. I quickly scanned the parking lot, looking for a safe place to hide or anything that might offer some kind of protection. But the rest stop was completely isolated. Just a small building, a few picnic tables, and a row of trees that couldn't offer any real cover. I sat in my car, gripping the wheel as the sedan rolled past the entrance, slowly, almost deliberately. I could barely make out the silhouette of the driver through the darkened windows. They didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. Instead, the car continued on, past the rest stop, heading down the highway. For a moment, I thought I might be free from whatever was happening. But then, just as I started to relax, something caught my eye. In the distance, I saw the headlights again, moving slowly, and this time they weren't on the highway. The black sedan had turned around. It was coming back. I froze. My mind raced. Was it a coincidence? Was I just overreacting? But the feeling deep down told me otherwise. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't risk being stuck in a place like this, where there was no one around to help me if something went wrong. I started the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror constantly. The black sedan was now far behind me, but I could tell it was gaining on me again. My pulse raced, and I kept my foot on the accelerator, pushing the car as fast as it could go. For what felt like hours, I kept driving, not daring to look behind me for too long. Every time I glanced in the mirror, the black sedan was still there, a shadow in the distance, just far enough to make me feel like I wasn't completely alone but not close enough to overtake me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights up ahead. I was entering a small town, a place I recognized from past trips. Relief flooded through me as I pulled off the highway and into the town, my hands still gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The sedan did not follow me into the town. It simply disappeared into the night. I parked at a gas station and sat there for several minutes, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing thoughts. When I finally looked up, I noticed something strange. The gas station attendant was staring at me through the window. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he knew exactly who I was, like he had been expecting me. That was when I realized the black sedan hadn't just been following me. It had been waiting for me to make that last turn. And it wasn't just one driver in that car. It was a trap. I never drove that highway alone again. And every time I remember that night, I can still feel the weight of those headlights creeping closer, closer, closer. I had been living in the city for years, but I never thought I would find myself in the middle of something like this. It was supposed to be a simple task, an after-hours work assignment that required me to check the office building's security systems on the upper floors. My boss had given me the keys, told me to ensure everything was in order, and left for the night. The building was quiet, the usual bustle of the day replaced by the eerie stillness of an empty skyscraper. But as I ascended to the higher floors, I quickly realized something was very wrong. It started innocently enough. The elevator hummed as it ascended, the soft whir of the motor the only sound accompanying me. The building's lights flickered faintly, giving off a faint hum, as if the building itself was settling into the night. The 35th floor, where I was supposed to start my work, felt sterile, unoccupied, the desks and chairs neatly arranged in perfect rows. It was exactly as I had left it earlier in the day. But then, as I moved through the offices, something caught my eye. It was a single file folder, placed slightly off-center on one of the desks. I froze. I was certain that the desk had been empty when I left. The folder wasn't there before. I quickly checked the rest of the office, but everything else was as I had left it, until I saw it again. Another floor. The 42nd floor. Again, the same eerie sensation. I had already checked the building's cameras and all seemed normal. The elevator was locked and the fire escapes were clear. There should have been no one here. Yet the same off-kilter feeling gnawed at me. I checked the cameras again, confirming that no one else had entered the building after hours. As I walked down the corridor of the 42nd floor, the office doors seemed to stare at me, their polished surfaces reflecting the dim fluorescent lighting. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing in one of the offices, still as a statue, as though frozen mid-motion. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. I turned and made my way to the next floor, a growing sense of unease following me like a shadow. The higher I climbed, the more intense the feeling became. The building, once so familiar, now felt alien, oppressive. The normally sterile silence of the office spaces was now filled with an undercurrent of something darker, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. On the 50th floor, I received a phone call from the security team. They were double-checking my progress and ensuring that I had completed all my rounds. As I spoke to them, a sound echoed from the hallway, a soft thud like something heavy had fallen. My stomach churned. I told the security team that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I followed the noise down the hall, every step echoing in the desolate silence. The sound had come from one of the locked offices, a high-security floor where only top executives had access. The door was ajar, and as I neared, I noticed that the lights inside the office were on, casting long shadows across the floor. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stepped closer. The office was empty, but something was different. The chair behind the desk was pushed back, the way it would be if someone had just gotten up. And on the desk, next to a stack of files, was a single business card. My business card. I hadn't been up here before. I hadn't visited this floor all week, let alone put my business card on the desk. My heart thudded in my chest. It had to be a mistake, right? But as I reached for the card, a sharp sound echoed from the hallway, footsteps. I spun around, heart pounding. No one was there. The hallway stretched out before me, silent and dark. But the footsteps continued, now growing louder, as if someone was walking toward me. I stepped back into the office, closing the door quietly behind me. I had no idea who or what was making the noise, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The floor began to feel claustrophobic, the air thick with an unsettling pressure. I couldn't understand what was happening. I had to finish my rounds, but my body refused to move. I stood frozen in the middle of the office, my eyes darting back and forth, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then the power went out. The building fell into total darkness, and I could hear the frantic beat of my own pulse in my ears. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, blood-red glow across the office. Panic set in. The stairs, the elevator, the windows, they all seemed unreachable. The building felt like it had become a labyrinth, and I had somehow lost my way. I tried to use my phone's flashlight to guide me, but it was useless. The screen was dim, and the signal was cutting in and out. It was like the building itself was swallowing me whole. As I made my way down the hall, I heard it again, the footsteps, now closer, unmistakable. I broke into a run. The elevator shaft loomed ahead, and I ran toward it, hoping to descend to the safety of the ground floor. But when I reached it, the doors were already open, revealing an empty, pitch-black space. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, hitting the button for the lobby. The elevator began its descent, but as it did, I noticed something in the corner of the car. A shadow, a reflection, something moving just out of the reach of my flashlight's beam. I tried to move, but the elevator came to a sudden halt. The lights flickered out completely, leaving me in complete darkness. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The response was a slow, deliberate creak of the elevator floor behind me, followed by a faint whisper in my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." The last thing I remember is the feeling of someone, or something, touching my shoulder. Then everything went black. I woke up in the lobby of the building several hours later. I don't know how I got there or how I managed to escape the floors above. The security cameras showed nothing. There were no records of anyone coming up with me that night. No explanations. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the echo of footsteps from an empty office building. I had been on the road for days, traveling from one small town to the next, escaping the pressures of city life. The idea of spending a few quiet nights in my RV, parked by a remote lake, sounded perfect. A chance to unwind, to embrace solitude. The lake was nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, and I had arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting an amber glow across the water. There was no one else in sight, just me in the vast wilderness. I parked the RV at the edge of the lake, setting up camp for the night. The air was crisp, and the stillness of the place was almost overwhelming. There was no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the soft lapping of water against the shore. I had all the time I needed to relax and let go of the stress I'd been carrying. As night fell, I lit a small fire outside and settled in with a book, feeling the warmth of the flames on my face. The world felt far away. Everything I needed was right there in my little mobile home. But that night, something began to feel off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The air had grown colder, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. No animals, no insects, not even the usual sounds of wind. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, fills the air with a sense of something hidden, something watching. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild. It had been a long day on the road after all. So I went inside the RV, locked the door behind me, and made a cup of tea. The lights flickered slightly, but I thought nothing of it, probably just the old wiring. I sat down at the small kitchen table, scrolling through my phone for a while, hoping to make some connection with the outside world. But there was no service as usual in these remote spots. Around 9:30 p.m. I began to hear something, footsteps or so I thought, crunching on the gravel just outside my RV. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned closer to the window, trying to see who it was, but there was nothing, only the faint glow of my campfire reflecting off the dark water. The footsteps stopped, and I felt a knot of unease form in my stomach. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but something about it didn't feel right. I had parked in a secluded area, miles from the nearest road. It was highly unlikely someone would be out here at this hour, let alone walking around my RV. I stood up, making my way to the door, trying to shake off the growing anxiety. Maybe someone was just passing through, or maybe it was a neighbor from another RV. I opened the door cautiously, the cold air rushing in, and stepped outside. The fire crackled, and I strained my ears, trying to detect any sounds. But there was nothing. No one in sight. I looked around the perimeter of my RV, inspecting the shadows in the trees, but everything appeared normal. Too normal, almost. I returned inside and locked the door again, but the unease wouldn't leave. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept darting back to the windows, to the darkness outside. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get when you're simply alone. It was something more primal, like there was a presence lingering just beyond sight. Around 10:30 p.m., the RV shook slightly, as though something had bumped into it. I jumped, heart racing, and turned to the door. My breath caught in my throat as I heard a soft knock. 1, 2, 3, on the side of the RV, right by where I had been sitting just minutes earlier. My mind screamed at me to open the door to see who was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something deep inside me knew that I shouldn't. The knock came again, but this time it was followed by a whisper, a voice I couldn't quite make out. My palms went clammy as I crouched down behind the kitchen counter, trying to steady my breath. I tried calling someone, anyone, on my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. I couldn't even get a text to go through. The knocking continued, growing more insistent, almost as though someone was pacing around the RV, tapping lightly but steadily on the metal. Then all of a sudden, the knocking stopped. I waited, every muscle tense. The silence was deafening. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. And then, just as suddenly, there was a loud crash, a banging noise like something heavy had fallen to the ground. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, but the scene outside hadn't changed. The fire was still burning low, casting long shadows across the ground. I stood there, frozen, staring out the window, trying to make sense of it all. And then I saw it, movement. A figure standing just beyond the campfire's reach, partially obscured by the trees. A tall, shadowy figure. It was still like it was watching the fire, watching me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My entire body was locked in place. The figure didn't move for what felt like an eternity, and then, slowly, it began to step forward. One slow, deliberate step at a time. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could see the outline. A figure, tall and thin, with no distinguishing features. My heart was hammering in my chest as I sank to the floor, hoping the figure wouldn't see me. I watched through the small crack in the curtain, my mind racing with thoughts. Who would be out there at this hour? What did they want? What if they weren't alone? The figure stopped, just stood there staring into the darkness. Then, without warning, it turned and walked back into the forest, fading into the trees, swallowed by the shadows. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't the same. It was thicker, more oppressive, as though something had been altered, disturbed. I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave. I started the engine, ignoring the rumbling in my stomach and the overwhelming fear. My hands were shaking as I turned the wheel, pulling away from the lake. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me. But the road behind was empty, the trees silent in the night. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, just to make sure I was safe. But as I sat in a gas station parking lot, staring at the dark forest in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from that lake, that something unseen had been waiting for me just beyond the trees. The abandoned hospital was a place I had only ever heard rumors about. Nestled on the outskirts of town, it had been closed for over a decade, the result of mysterious accidents and unexplained disappearances among the staff and patients. Despite its reputation, the hospital had become a place of fascination for urban explorers, photographers, and thrill seekers, people like me. I wasn't one to back away from a challenge, especially when I had the opportunity to explore something so infamous. Armed with my camera, a flashlight, and a backpack full of supplies, I drove out to the hospital early one morning. The town's residents spoke in hushed tones about the building, warning me to stay away. But the curiosity gnawed at me, and I was determined to uncover whatever secrets the place might hold. The hospital was surrounded by dense woods, and the drive was long and winding. As I approached the building, I could see its decaying structure looming in the distance, its once white exterior now covered in grime and ivy. The windows were boarded up, and the main entrance, once grand and welcoming, was now a dark void, waiting to swallow anyone brave enough to enter. I parked my car a few hundred yards away, not wanting to draw too much attention, and grabbed my gear. As I walked closer, the air grew thicker, and a sense of foreboding settled over me. The heavy silence was broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. It was as if the entire world had gone mute. I stood at the entrance for a moment, debating whether I should turn back. The place felt wrong, empty but not silent, like something was hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. But the thrill of exploration won out, and I pushed open the rusted doors. They creaked loudly, a sound that seemed too sharp for the stillness of the surroundings. The dark hallways inside were choked with dust, and the air had a stale, musty smell like forgotten memories. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper and cracked floors. The hospital was eerily silent. It felt like no one had stepped inside for years. But as I ventured deeper into the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My footsteps echoed through the halls, a sound too loud for the quiet, too unnatural for a place that had been abandoned for so long. I tried to focus on the task at hand, exploring, taking photographs, but the unease was building. The sound of my own breathing seemed too loud, and the silence around me felt unnatural. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I explored room after room, each one more unsettling than the last. Empty hospital beds, broken equipment, papers scattered across the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry. But there was no sign of what had happened to the staff or the patients. The building seemed suspended in time, as though it were waiting for something to return. At one point, I stumbled upon what appeared to be an old operating room. The heavy metal table in the center was covered in dust, and the walls were lined with rusting surgical tools. It felt like I was intruding on something that was never meant to be disturbed. As I moved around the room, my flashlight flickered. I paused, annoyed by the failing light, and tapped it a few times to get it working again. That's when I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the building. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I was alone, or at least I had thought I was. The noise echoed through the halls, but no footsteps followed, no other signs of life. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight now shaking in my hand, illuminating only shadows. I tried to dismiss it as the building settling, the old wood shifting. But the more I moved, the more I noticed other strange things. The faintest sound of someone walking, the feeling of being followed, and the strange cold spots in the rooms I entered. I could hear my own voice softly calling out, but nothing else responded. As I made my way down one of the long hallways, I saw it. At the far end of the corridor was a door half open, a soft light spilling from the crack. It wasn't the harsh yellow light of a flashlight, it was softer, almost inviting. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to go toward it, but my legs moved before I could stop them. The closer I got, the colder it became. The door opened on its own, and I stepped inside. The room was a small office, barely more than a storage closet, but there on the desk was an old photo. It was faded, yellowed with age, and I could barely make out the image. But I knew what it was, the hospital staff standing together in front of the building. One of them was a man I recognized from the rumors, Dr. Miller, the head physician who had mysteriously disappeared after the hospital closed. His eyes stared back at me, cold and hollow, as if he were looking straight through me. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but the room felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in and my breath came faster. The temperature had dropped so drastically that I could see my own breath in the air. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the stillness, the oppressive silence that had been with me since I stepped inside. I grabbed my camera, fumbling with it in a panic, and snapped a few pictures of the room, trying to calm myself. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. There, in the corner of one of the photos, just barely visible, was a shadow. A figure standing perfectly still, staring directly at the camera. The figure was blurry, indistinct, but its shape was unmistakable. A tall, gaunt man wearing an old hospital uniform standing in the doorway. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. The door was still closed. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in the space between worlds. Without thinking, I shoved the camera into my bag and ran for the exit. The building seemed to fight me at every turn, doors that wouldn't open, hallways that twisted back on themselves. My footsteps were louder now, echoing like they were coming from a place far away. When I finally burst out of the front doors, I was gasping for air, as if I had just escaped something much worse than I had realized. I didn't look back. I didn't even stop until I was safely in my car, driving away from the hospital as fast as I could. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I could swear I saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the entrance, watching me leave. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that hospital. I still have the photographs I took, but every time I look at them, the figure in the corner seems to grow clearer, more defined. Sometimes I hear a whisper in the silence, a voice that sounds eerily familiar. The abandoned hospital was not just a place of memories. It was a place that still held its secrets, and some of those secrets might never leave. I had always been drawn to the solitude of nature. Hiking through remote landscapes where no one could reach me felt like a true escape from the chaos of the world. But there are places where isolation can quickly turn into something far more dangerous, and that's what I learned the hard way during one winter hike I'll never forget. It started as an ordinary hiking trip, or at least it should have been. I had planned a solo adventure through a well-known trail in a remote part of the mountain range. The winter season had begun to take hold, but the forecast promised clear skies and a manageable temperature. I packed my gear, warm clothes, water, snacks, a map, and my trusted flashlight. I left early in the morning, the world still dark and silent. As I drove toward the trailhead, I noticed the snow had begun to fall, but it was light, almost comforting. I reached the trailhead by noon, a small parking area at the edge of the woods. The trail was wide and well marked at first, but soon it narrowed, winding through thick woods and up a steep ridge. The snow had picked up by now, turning the world around me into a quiet, frozen landscape. The trees were heavy with snow, their limbs creaking under the weight, and the air was sharp, biting at my skin. The hike was peaceful at first, just the crunch of snow under my boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. The cold didn't bother me. I was used to the harshness of winter hiking. But as the day wore on, the trail began to get more treacherous. Snowdrifts grew higher, and visibility was reduced by the heavy snowfall. I checked my map, confirming that I was still on the right path. The trail was supposed to loop back to the parking area by dusk. I wasn't in a hurry, so I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. But as the afternoon wore on, something began to feel off. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the snow began to fall in thick, swirling gusts. My visibility dropped to just a few feet in front of me. I looked around, but the once familiar trail markers seemed to have disappeared into the whiteout. The world around me had turned into an endless expanse of snow and trees. There were no footprints in the snow anymore, nothing to tell me I was on the right track. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. I had faced worse weather conditions on other hikes, and as long as I stayed calm, I could handle this. But then I noticed something else, something unsettling. The trail, which should have been a continuous loop, seemed to be going in circles. I checked my map again, but I couldn't make sense of it. The trail I had been following didn't match any of the paths on the map. I had passed the same tree several times, and now there were fresh tracks in the snow, tracks that weren't mine. A cold feeling washed over me, but I tried to brush it off. It could have been someone else, another hiker who had taken a different route. But there was no sign of another person on the trail, no footprints leading off into the trees, no abandoned gear, nothing. Just the tracks, half covered by the falling snow, leading off in a direction that felt wrong. The wind howled louder, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. I pulled my coat tighter and kept moving. I had no choice but to follow the tracks, hoping they would lead me to safety. But the deeper I ventured, the more disoriented I became. The storm had grown stronger, and the visibility was almost zero. I couldn't hear anything except the wind and the occasional crunch of snow beneath my boots. I was lost. The reality of it hit me hard. I had no idea which direction was the right one, and the storm had turned into a full-blown blizzard. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but of course there was nothing. I had prepared for this. I knew the area had spotty reception, but I didn't expect to need it. Now it felt like a cruel joke. My heartbeat quickened, and panic started to creep in. I forced myself to calm down. Panicking would only make it worse. I remembered the emergency whistle in my pack. I blew it, but the sound was swallowed by the storm before it could travel more than a few feet. I decided to turn back. I retraced my steps, but the trail was gone, swallowed up by the snow. The trees were no longer familiar, and the landscape seemed to shift with each step. Every direction looked the same, an endless white world. And then I heard it. A sound. A soft crunch of snow, followed by the faintest whisper of a voice. I spun around, but no one was there. The snow had stopped falling for a brief moment, and I could see the landscape clearly for a second, just long enough to realize that there was someone or something standing at the edge of the trees watching me. The figure was tall, cloaked in snow, but still distinct, standing motionless as the wind howled around it. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew I wasn't alone. I had the distinct feeling that whoever or whatever it was had been following me for a while. My heart raced, and I broke into a run, even though I knew it was a foolish thing to do. The cold air burned my lungs as I pushed through the snow, the wind stinging my face. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the crunching of footsteps behind me, getting closer with each passing moment. The figure was no longer standing still. It was moving, following me. The blizzard intensified, and I lost all sense of direction. Every tree, every rock, every piece of the landscape seemed to blur into a white void. I stumbled, falling into the snow, exhausted and disoriented. I could barely feel my fingers or toes, the cold seeping into my bones. The footsteps behind me had stopped. I lay there, my breath shallow, struggling to stay conscious. I was trapped in the wilderness, alone in the freezing cold, with no way out. I don't know how I made it out of the woods. By the time I found the trail again, the sun was nearly gone, and the darkness was closing in fast. I stumbled back to the parking area, my body shaking from the cold and exhaustion. I never saw the figure again, but I still don't know what it was. My friends and family think I imagined it, just a product of fatigue and panic. But I know what I saw. Something was out there with me, and it had been watching me, waiting. Maybe it was the wilderness itself, or maybe something darker. But I can't shake the feeling that the wilderness is never truly empty. I had heard the stories about Lake Blackwood before, but like most things, I didn't believe them. It was a remote spot, known to few, deep in the forest where few dared to venture. The lake was said to be haunted by the tragic deaths of a couple of hikers years ago, lost in a blizzard, their bodies never recovered. But that was years ago. People love their ghost stories. It was a late December weekend when I decided to hike to the lake. I'd been on numerous solo trips, and the thought of exploring a desolate lake surrounded by snow seemed perfect. It wasn't even on the official trail map, but I had found an old hiking journal online with a rough sketch of the path. The weather report was clear, blue skies and cold temperatures. Nothing to worry about. I started my hike early, the sun still low, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence only deep snow can bring. It was peaceful, too peaceful. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed the snow seemed to get thicker. The trees were more clustered together, the path narrowing as I pressed forward. After a few hours, I reached the lake, or at least what I thought was the lake. The vast expanse of ice stretched in front of me, smooth and untouched by footprints. It looked beautiful yet foreboding, like a frozen wasteland. The wind had picked up as I made my way to the edge, the air biting into my skin. I could see my breath in the cold, a mist that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. I walked along the perimeter, drawn to the emptiness. There were no signs of life, no animals, no signs of any humans for miles. I stopped and looked out over the frozen water. The lake stretched out before me, a smooth, glassy surface that was untouched, gleaming like a mirror under the weak sunlight. The world seemed frozen in time. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, the way the ice groaned under the pressure of the cold. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was the crunching of footsteps. Slow, heavy steps as if someone was walking on the ice behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned quickly, expecting to see another hiker, someone else who had decided to visit the lake. But there was nothing. Just the vast emptiness of the frozen lake and the distant tree line. No footprints in the snow, no signs of movement. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the sensation. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be the wind, or maybe I had imagined it altogether. I had been hiking alone for hours, and the isolation was starting to take its toll. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I decided to move away from the lake, hoping the sound would stop if I got further into the woods. But as I walked, the crunching followed. It was unmistakable now, and it wasn't coming from behind me, it was coming from the ice. I turned again, faster this time, but still there was no one there. The lake was just as empty, the silence almost suffocating. Then the real panic set in. I noticed something at the edge of the ice. A shape. A figure standing just on the other side of the lake, motionless like a silhouette frozen in place. It was tall, hunched slightly, but not quite like a person. It was an outline against the light of the snow-covered ground, but there was no detail. Just a shape that seemed too still, too unnatural. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at it, willing myself to believe it was just a trick of the light or a distant tree branch. But the longer I looked, the more solid it seemed, like it was actually there, standing in the same place as I was, only on the ice. Then it moved. It didn't walk toward me, it simply glided across the ice, its movement unnatural, like it was floating. It was slow, deliberate, and the crunching of the ice grew louder with each step. It wasn't the soft sound of a person walking. It was more like the sound of something dragging across the frozen surface, as if the figure was dragging something behind it. I turned and ran. I didn't care how foolish it seemed. My instincts kicked in and I bolted through the snow, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the sound of crunching ice growing louder, closer. It was chasing me. I ran harder, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the snow was deep and my movements slowed. It was all I could do to keep going, my mind screaming at me to stop, to look back, to understand what was happening. But I couldn't. I could feel it behind me, the slow, deliberate movement that was gaining on me. I stumbled and fell, the weight of the cold sinking into my bones. As I tried to push myself up, I heard it, louder now, closer. A voice, a whisper. It wasn't a voice that anyone could understand, just a soft, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through the snow and the ice. sending chills straight down my spine. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I got to my feet and kept running, not knowing where I was going anymore, just needing to get away from whatever was following me. The wind howled around me, biting at my exposed skin, but I barely felt it. The only thing I could focus on was the sound behind me, getting closer with each passing second. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, the figure had stopped. It was back at the lake, standing at the shore, its outline once again frozen against the white expanse of snow. I didn't wait to see if it moved again. I didn't care. I kept running, not stopping until I reached my car, where I collapsed inside, locking the doors behind me. The storm picked up on the drive home. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me on the road, but there was nothing. The stories I had heard about Lake Blackwood, about the hikers lost to the storm, were still in my mind. But now they weren't just stories. They were warnings. I haven't been back to that lake, and I don't plan to. Some places are better left alone. It was the kind of night where the cold seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Snow was falling in heavy sheets, the kind that made the world feel smaller, suffocating. The streets of the small town were practically deserted, and the streetlights cast a dull yellow glow over everything, reflecting off the ice-covered roads. I had been traveling for days. A series of unfortunate events had left me stranded, and I was on my way to a remote village up north, hoping to catch the last train of the night. There was no other way out. No buses, no taxis, no one around to give a ride. It had been a long day of waiting and hoping, and by the time I reached the station, it felt like the universe was determined to make me stay. The train was my only way out of here. The station was small, old, and the light flickered above the platform. There was no one else around. I checked my watch. The train was still scheduled to arrive in 15 minutes, but it didn't feel right. The station was eerily silent, not even the usual clanking of the tracks in the distance. I stepped inside the shelter, the warmth hitting me like a shock after the freezing cold. I pulled my coat tighter around me and sat down, my eyes darting to the empty tracks. The train was usually a routine thing. I'd been on it once or twice before. But tonight everything felt off. I checked my phone again. No signal. It had been like that for the past hour. The train station was in the middle of nowhere, and the only connection to the outside world was through that train. The silence pressed in on me like a weight. It was too quiet. Even the wind had died down. Then, just as I was about to stand up, I heard it, a faint noise coming from down the tracks. The unmistakable sound of train wheels on metal. I looked around, but no one else was in the station. The wind had picked up outside, and the snow was coming down harder, swirling in the air. Still, the train was coming. I could hear it. I stepped out into the freezing air, the biting cold slapping me in the face. I squinted against the snowstorm, and sure enough, the lights of the train were visible in the distance, slowly making its way toward the platform. It was running late, but it was coming. The closer the train got, the more I realized something wasn't right. The train was slower than it should have been, crawling along the tracks like it was struggling through the snow. There was something about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was real. It was definitely the last train. I tried to shake off the strange feeling, but I couldn't. My instincts were kicking in. I stepped back onto the platform as the train came to a slow stop in front of me, the air around it cold and still, the only sound the soft hiss of the brakes. The doors slid open and I stepped inside. The interior was old-fashioned, dimly lit, with dark wood paneling and worn-out upholstery. But there was something even stranger. The train was empty. No passengers, no conductor, no one. I hesitated, then found a seat near the back, staring out at the snowstorm through the windows. The train slowly began to pull away from the station, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The darkness outside was swallowing us whole, and I could feel the chill even through the glass. The train was moving now faster, but still slow, too slow. I could hear the engine working harder, the sound of the metal grinding on the tracks echoing through the car. Something about the speed of it unnerved me, but I convinced myself it was nothing. The snowstorm had probably made the tracks slippery, causing the delay. Minutes turned to hours, or so it felt. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. The train was supposed to take a few hours, but this felt wrong. The train's interior was too quiet. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of life. There was no hum of the lights, no faint scent of food, no noise of the wheels against the tracks. Just the sound of the engine straining as we moved through the storm. I stood up and walked to the next car, hoping to find someone, a conductor, a fellow passenger, someone. But when I opened the door, the next car was just as empty. Every seat, every row completely deserted. I looked around frantically. The lights flickered briefly as I made my way down the aisle, but there was nothing to explain the feeling crawling up my spine. As I turned back to head toward my seat, the lights suddenly went out. The train plunged into darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then a voice. It was faint at first, almost too quiet to hear over the sound of the train itself. "Where are you going?" I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice. No one was there. My heart began to race and my breath quickened. The voice repeated itself, louder this time, closer. "Where are you going?" It was coming from behind me, from somewhere near the back of the train. I turned and ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing against the silence. As I neared the end of the car, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the far end of the car, standing in the doorway between the last two cars, was a figure. It was silhouetted in the dim light of the train, and I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. I couldn't move. I was frozen. The figure spoke again. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my hand instinctively grabbing for the door. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. The train screeched to a halt, and I was thrown forward into the cold, empty space. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was back at the station, the same small, desolate station covered in snow. The train was gone. I never found out who or what was on that train. But I know one thing, I never want to ride it again. The night had fallen early that winter, as it often did in the mountains. The storm had begun in the afternoon, a light flurry of snow at first, but it quickly escalated into a full-blown blizzard by dusk. The wind howled through the narrow pass, and the temperature dropped well below freezing. The road ahead was barely visible, and my car's headlights seemed to do little more than illuminate the dense snowflakes that battered against the windshield. I had been traveling alone for over an hour, trying to make my way to a small inn nestled deep in the valley, where I had reservations for the night. The map I had been following was outdated, and I soon found myself on a small, winding dirt road, which hadn't been properly plowed. I should have turned back, but the thought of spending another night in a cold, dark car with the storm raging outside was unbearable. The road became steeper, the snow piled higher. The car's wheels struggled for traction, slipping and sliding as the blizzard swallowed the world around me. The tires dug into the snow, but it was hopeless. In a sudden lurch, the car came to a stop. I cursed under my breath. There was no cell signal here, and I had no idea how far I was from the inn. My only option was to walk. I grabbed my coat, boots, and a flashlight from the trunk before stepping out into the storm. The wind almost knocked me over as it howled through the mountain pass, biting at my face and hands. Visibility was almost zero. The road that had seemed like a route to safety now looked like a never-ending abyss of white. I turned the flashlight on, its beam cutting through the snowflakes, but it seemed to barely illuminate the thick blizzard around me. I started walking, hoping that I was heading in the right direction, but every step felt as if I was moving farther away from safety. As I trudged through the snow, I began to realize that the storm was more than just an inconvenience. It felt oppressive, as though the mountains themselves were pushing against me. The winds were howling now, a continuous, ominous sound that seemed to fill the air and drown out all other noise. There was no sign of life, no animals, no distant lights from the inn. only the endless, swirling white. Then I saw it. A shape in the distance, barely visible through the storm. At first, I thought it was a tree or perhaps a boulder, but as I drew closer, it became clear that it was a figure, a person standing still in the snow. My heart began to race. Who in their right mind would be out here in the middle of the blizzard? I had to be imagining things. I stumbled forward, my breath coming in short gasps, the cold biting at my skin. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to react as I approached. I raised my voice, calling out to them, but the wind stole my words, scattering them like dust. When I was only a few feet away, the figure turned. It was a man, or at least, it appeared to be a man, his face obscured by a heavy scarf and hood. His posture was stiff, rigid, as if he had been standing there for hours, or perhaps days. His clothes were heavy and dark, his boots caked with snow. But something about him was wrong. His presence, his stillness, felt unnatural. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the wind. He didn't answer. Instead, he began to move, slowly, deliberately. He turned his back to me and started walking, moving away from me without a word. I hesitated, watching him for a moment. He was heading in the same direction I was, but I couldn't understand why he hadn't said anything. He didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. I decided to follow him. Maybe he knew a shortcut, or perhaps he was headed to the same inn. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. But as I walked, the snowstorm seemed to grow stronger. The winds were relentless, biting through my clothes, and my steps became harder and harder. My legs were tiring, and I felt a creeping unease in the pit of my stomach. The figure was still ahead of me, just a few yards away, but his movement was becoming more erratic. Every so often he would stop, turn slightly, and then keep walking again, as if checking to see if I was still there. Then he stopped. For a moment I thought he might speak to me. I thought maybe he would give me some directions or at least acknowledge my presence. But instead he simply stood there, facing the storm. I walked closer, calling out, but the wind swallowed my words. When I reached him, he didn't look at me. His face was hidden under the scarf, but I could feel his eyes on me. Something about his stillness, his unnatural stillness, sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to speak again, but my voice caught in my throat. I reached out to touch his arm, but as my hand made contact, he jerked away, a sharp movement that seemed out of place. That's when I saw it. At his feet in the snow was a trail, footprints, faint but unmistakable. But they weren't leading in any particular direction. They seemed to come from nowhere. Just random, disjointed marks in the snow, crisscrossing in every direction. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at the man again. His body was slightly hunched, his head bowed as though he were listening to something in the distance. The wind howled, but I could swear I heard something else. A whisper, faint like a voice just on the edge of hearing. And then he turned. Without a word, without any indication that he even saw me, he began to walk again. But this time he wasn't heading toward the inn. He was walking toward the edge of the mountain. "No, wait!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. He just kept walking, the distance between us growing with every step. His figure grew smaller, swallowed by the storm. I ran after him, my legs burning, but the snow was thick, and the wind made it almost impossible to move. The man was almost gone now, a shadow in the white expanse. I couldn't catch up, and then in an instant he vanished. I stood there, alone, the storm swirling around me. There was no sign of him, no footprints, no trail. Just the howling wind and the oppressive darkness of the mountain. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the storm, but eventually I turned and made my way back to the car. The snow was deeper now, and the wind stronger than before. But I never saw the man again. The inn, when I finally found it, was just as empty. No lights, no warmth, no sign of life. I've never been able to explain what happened that night. The man, the strange footprints, the whispering in the storm. All I know is that I should never have followed him. The storm was relentless. It had been snowing for over 24 hours, with no sign of letting up. The weather report had warned of it, but there had been no way to predict just how bad it would get. Now I found myself trapped in the small, isolated cabin I'd rented for the weekend, high up in the mountains. My plan had been simple: get some rest, clear my head, enjoy the snow, and return home before the roads became impassable. But now, the snow piled up higher by the hour, and I realized just how far I was from civilization. No neighbors, no other houses for miles, and the radio signal had long since died. I stared out the window, watching the snowflakes whirl in the wind, thick and fast. The world outside had become an endless blur of white. The wind howled through the trees, its eerie wail carrying through the cabin walls. The isolation felt heavy, suffocating, but the solitude was familiar. I'd chosen it for the peace, the quiet, the space to think. Yet, as night fell, the cabin seemed colder, darker than I remembered when I first arrived. At first, everything had been calm. I unpacked, lit the wood stove, and settled into my routine. The cabin had an old charm to it: wooden beams, rustic furniture, and the faint scent of pine from the surrounding forest. The fire crackled merrily, casting flickering shadows across the walls. But the further the storm raged, the more the cabin began to feel like a cage, like something was closing in. Then it started. At first, it was subtle, a soft thudding sound from upstairs. I froze, listening. But when I checked, there was nothing. I thought it might be the wind, or perhaps the old house settling in the cold. But then the sound came again. A heavy footstep, unmistakable, followed by a creak in the floorboards above. I told myself it was the house. I told myself it was just the snow building up on the roof, or the wind, or any number of explanations. But as the night wore on, the noises became more distinct, louder, closer, more deliberate. A slow, rhythmic thumping from the second floor, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping against the floor. My heart began to pound. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the radio, but the static was deafening. The fire crackled, but it couldn't seem to warm me. I grabbed a book, but it didn't help. The thumping continued, louder now, and the scraping sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. I stood up, my legs shaking. I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was just my imagination. I had to check. I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The air upstairs was colder, almost frigid, despite the fire downstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I stood still, listening. There was nothing now, no footsteps, no scraping. But the silence felt worse than the noise. I approached the bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the flashlight's beam flickered across the dark interior. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled, but everything else seemed in place. Still, the silence stretched on, pressing in from all sides. But as I turned to leave, I saw something. On the floor, near the corner of the room, was a faint mark in the dust. A handprint, perfectly clear, as though someone had pressed their palm against the floor. I knelt down, feeling the coldness of the air in the room and the chill on the floor beneath me. The print was recent. Far too recent for it to be a leftover from a previous guest. Then I heard it. A voice, faint at first, a whisper. Help. I froze. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was there. I wasn't imagining it. It was coming from the corner of the room where the handprint was. It was almost as if the floor itself was speaking, the words seeping from the cracks between the wooden planks. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper continued, growing louder, more frantic. Help me, please. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. My mind was racing. The storm outside was battering the windows, but the howling wind couldn't drown out the voice in my head. I tried to convince myself I was losing my mind. I'd been alone for too long. The isolation was getting to me. But as I turned to look at the staircase, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A shadow, just a flicker, moving across the wall at the top of the stairs. My blood ran cold. There was no one else here. I was alone, or at least I had thought I was. Then the knocking started. It wasn't a loud banging, but a soft, methodical tap 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 against the front door. I grabbed a kitchen knife, heart hammering in my chest, and crept toward the door, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The tapping continued, steady and unnerving. "Who's there?" I called, my voice hoarse. There was no response, only the persistent tapping. I opened the door, just a crack, and peered out into the storm. The wind whipped snow into my face, and the world outside was a blur of white. No one was there. I shut the door quickly, locking it, feeling the weight of the silence press against me. I stood in the dark, listening. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees, but the tapping on the door had stopped. I stared at the door, wondering if I had imagined it, and then I heard it again. The whisper, "Let me in." My stomach twisted. I dropped the knife and backed away from the door, heart racing. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. The whispers grew louder, and then they stopped. I turned to the window, expecting to see nothing but snow. But there, standing in the storm, in the swirling white blizzard, was a figure, a tall, dark shape moving slowly toward the cabin. I could barely make out its features, but I didn't need to. The figure was unmistakable. It was the same shape I had seen through the window earlier that day, the same one that had been watching me, standing just out of sight. I wasn't alone. I never had been. And I couldn't escape. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for weeks. It was my way of escaping the chaos of city life and taking a break from endless notifications, deadlines, and social obligations. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far away from anyone or anything. It was simple, rustic, and utterly secluded. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me, a pile of books, and the sound of the wind in the trees. The drive up had been uneventful, though as I climbed higher into the mountains, the weather began to change. Snow started to fall in soft flurries, and by the time I reached the cabin, the forest had been transformed into a quiet, white wonderland. It was beautiful, but also unnervingly silent. The first evening passed peacefully. I cooked a simple meal on the wood-burning stove, sat by the fire, and read until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The sound of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the wooden walls became background noise as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the snow had thickened. I trudged outside to gather some firewood, my boots crunching loudly in the fresh powder. As I worked, I noticed something that sent a chill up my spine. Footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were larger, heavier, and they circled the cabin, weaving in and out of the trees. At first, I thought maybe they were from a local hiker or hunter. But why would someone be out here in the middle of a snowstorm so far off the beaten path? I decided not to dwell on it. Whoever it was had probably passed through and moved on. The day went by quietly. I stayed inside, reading and tending to the fire. By evening, the snow had picked up again and the temperature dropped even lower. I cooked dinner and turned in early, the warmth of the cabin cocooning me against the howling wind outside. I don't know what woke me up that night, but when I opened my eyes, my heart was already pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I heard it. Crunch, crunch. The sound of footsteps in the snow. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were circling just like the footprints I'd seen that morning. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the snowy landscape outside. But there was nothing. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, erasing any trace of the footsteps. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe a branch had fallen or an animal had wandered close. But deep down I knew better. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound seemed amplified, every creak of the cabin a potential threat. When morning came, I finally mustered the courage to go outside and check the snow. The footprints were back, fresh and distinct. They circled the cabin again, but this time they stopped at the front door. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been standing there just outside in the middle of the night. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept looking out the windows, searching for any sign of movement, but the woods remained eerily still. As evening approached, the snowstorm worsened. I thought about leaving, but the narrow mountain road would be impassable. I was trapped. That night, I locked the door, shoved furniture against it, and kept the fire roaring. I sat in the corner of the room with a flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other, straining to hear over the howling wind. Hours passed, and I began to think that maybe, just maybe, the storm would keep whoever it was away. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost tentative, as if whoever was on the other side wanted to test my reaction. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Hello? Is anyone there?" It was a man's voice, muffled by the door and the wind. He sounded calm, even friendly, but something about the tone set my teeth on edge. "Please," he called again. "I'm lost. I need help." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My instincts told me to stay silent, to pretend the cabin was empty. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps moving away from the door and toward the window. I turned off the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. Through the small gap in the curtain, I saw a shadow pass by the window. It lingered for a moment, and I could feel whoever it was watching, waiting, and then just like that they were gone. The next morning, the storm had finally passed. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and the world outside looked calm and serene. But the snow told a different story. The footprints were everywhere, circling the cabin over and over again. They led to the door, the windows, and even the roof. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, shoved them into the car, and left without looking back. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, a retreat from the chaos of the world. But now, it would always be a place of unanswered questions and lingering fear. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted. All I know is that they were watching, and they'll probably watch again. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a chance to escape the city and take some time to recharge. A small, rustic cabin tucked away in the mountains was the perfect solution. Isolated, peaceful, and far from the constant hum of modern life. No distractions, no work emails, just me and the serene beauty of the forest. The weather was perfect when I arrived. Clear skies, the scent of pine in the air, and the sun dappling through the trees. I unpacked, set up the cabin, and spent the evening enjoying the solitude. I made dinner on the wood stove, read a bit, and went to bed early. The absence of sound, save for the occasional crackle of the fire, was soothing. But by the second night, the peace was beginning to feel oppressive. I'd noticed earlier that the cabin had a landline phone. It seemed odd, considering how remote the location was, but it was there nonetheless. The number wasn't listed anywhere, so I assumed it was probably an emergency line or just a throwback to a time before cell phones. Regardless, I hadn't planned to use it. The place was so isolated that I hadn't expected anyone to be able to call me, and I certainly hadn't expected to need to call anyone. That evening, as I was reading, the phone rang. I glanced at the receiver in surprise. Who could be calling? There was no one nearby for miles, no cell service, nothing but empty forest surrounding the cabin. I picked it up hesitantly. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end, the only sound being the faint crackling of static. Then a voice, a raspy whisper, sounded through the receiver. "Help me." My blood ran cold. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. The panic in the words felt genuine. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" The line went silent. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. But then the voice returned, lower this time, almost inaudible, as if the person was speaking from a great distance. Please? I'm lost. It's cold. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The voice sounded so real, so desperate. Where are you? I asked, suddenly unsure of what I should do. I can help. Are you near the cabin? But there was no response. Instead, the phone line crackled and went dead. I stared at the receiver in disbelief, my pulse racing. What the hell had just happened? The voice had been real. It had sounded like someone was out there, stranded in the snow, desperate for help. I didn't know what to think. The storm outside had begun to pick up again, the wind howling through the trees, and the air was growing colder. But I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, or if someone was genuinely in trouble. Maybe someone had gotten lost in the storm, and their phone had somehow dialed the cabin by mistake. Maybe they were trying to reach help, and the line had simply been crossed. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to check the area near the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and bundled up in my coat, stepping out into the snow. The wind was sharp, biting at my skin as I walked through the thickening snow. I called out, but there was no response. Nothing but the sound of the storm, the trees swaying in the wind. After an hour of searching, I was nearly frozen, but there was still no sign of anyone. No footprints in the snow. No sounds of distress. Just the isolation of the mountains and the relentless wind. I returned to the cabin, puzzled and uneasy. Had it been a prank? A strange coincidence? I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of dread lingered in the pit of my stomach. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard the phone ring again. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I knew I should ignore it, but something about the situation compelled me to pick up the receiver. Hello? I said, my voice shaky. This time there was no static. There was no pause. The voice was clear, calm, too calm. You didn't come, the voice said. You should have come. I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't the same voice as before. It was deeper, colder, as if it was someone or something else. Who is this? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. The voice laughed softly, a low, mocking sound. You don't belong here. You never did. I slammed the receiver down, my breath coming in short gasps. My heart was racing in my chest. What the hell was happening? Was this some sick joke? Or was someone out there watching me? I locked the door, grabbed a heavy chair, and wedged it against the doorknob. I didn't know what to do. The storm outside raged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I tried to call for help. But when I picked up the phone again, the line was dead. The next few hours were a blur of fear. I didn't dare sleep. I stayed by the fire, listening to every sound, every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By morning, the storm had passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The cabin seemed quieter than it should have been, too quiet. I grabbed my things ready to leave, but as I headed toward the door, I froze. There, on the ground outside, were fresh footprints, large, deliberate, and leading directly to the cabin door. I turned around, heart pounding, and looked at the phone. It sat there, silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. It wasn't just a phone call. Someone had been out there, watching me, waiting for me to react. And they were still out there. In this story, the protagonist is trapped by both the isolation of the cabin and the eerie, distorted phone calls. The ambiguity of whether the caller is real or simply a figment of their imagination amplifies the sense of dread and paranoia, and the presence of footprints outside hints that something, or someone, is lurking just beyond the cabin. The tension between safety and danger, the unknown and the known, creates an unsettling, nerve-wracking atmosphere that leaves readers with a lingering sense of fear. I've always found long drives calming. There's something about the steady hum of the engine and the isolation of the road that helps clear my mind. So when I decided to take a solo trip up the coast, I was excited. The plan was simple. Drive along the scenic route, stop at small towns, take some photos, and relax. What I didn't anticipate, however, was the terror that would unfold in the dark of the night. It was around midnight when I passed through the small, unremarkable town. The headlights of my car sliced through the foggy air, casting long, distorted shadows on the side of the road. I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour, and the silence of the open road was beginning to feel oppressive. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. My phone had no signal, just a dead zone of nothingness. I was exhausted, but I didn't want to stop yet. I was about 50 miles away from the next town, and it didn't seem worth it to pull over just yet. But as I passed a rundown diner, I felt the unmistakable sense of being watched. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the loneliness of the road and the creeping fog. But as I continued, I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. A car had appeared behind me, seemingly out of nowhere. It was too close, too bright. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the car stayed right there, tailing me. At first, I thought maybe it was just another traveler. But as the minutes ticked by, the car didn't pass. Instead, it stayed a few feet behind, maintaining the exact same distance no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. I could see the silhouette of the driver in my mirror, but nothing more. No license plate, just the blinding lights. I tried to shake the unease, but it grew steadily. I wasn't sure why, but I began to speed up. I pressed the gas harder, pushing my car faster down the winding highway. But the tailing car stayed right behind me, as if it were deliberately matching my every move. No matter how I maneuvered, how I tried to shake it, the car stayed there. A constant, unnerving presence. My mind raced. I couldn't tell if it was some sort of prank or if this person was genuinely following me for some other reason. Every part of me screamed to pull over and confront them, but I knew that could be dangerous. So I kept driving, hoping that I'd soon reach a more populated area. Then the car's headlights flickered. It was almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A brief blink of darkness before the lights came back on, still blinding in the rearview mirror. That's when I realized something was wrong. The car wasn't just tailing me, it was testing me. I couldn't stop the growing panic that clutched at my chest. The fog was getting thicker, and the road was winding through dense trees. I could barely see the edge of the road, and the isolation felt like a pressure on my skull. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. The car had shifted. It was now pulling alongside me. I gasped. The car was now level with mine, but I still couldn't make out the driver. I could see nothing but the headlights and a faint shadow behind the wheel. And then, in one quick motion, the car swerved in front of me, cutting me off. I slammed on the brakes, barely avoiding a collision. The car in front of me skidded to a stop, and for a moment, everything was still. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the engine of my car rumbled ominously. I should have driven past. I should have accelerated and gotten away. But something froze me to the spot. I could hear my breath, the sound of my pulse in my ears. Then the driver's side door of the car in front of me creaked open. I held my breath as a figure stepped out. The person was tall, hooded, and completely obscured in shadow. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but I could feel their presence looming in the dark. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward my car. I quickly locked my doors, my fingers trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. The road was deserted. No one would come if I screamed. The nearest town was miles away. The figure stopped in front of my car, standing there in the mist. It felt like time stretched, like I was stuck in a nightmare where I couldn't wake up. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure turned abruptly and began to walk back toward their car. I couldn't take my eyes off them, couldn't tear my gaze away, even though I knew I should. When the figure reached the car, they paused, turned their head toward me for just a second, and then without a word they got back in, slammed the door, and drove off. I sat there, frozen, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The sound of the engine faded as the car disappeared into the fog. and all that remained was the eerie silence of the road. I didn't wait another moment. I put the car in gear, floored the gas pedal, and drove as fast as I could toward the nearest town. The rest of the drive was a blur. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit gas station where I refueled, still feeling the echoes of the encounter. I never saw the car again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the driver had been waiting for me. I don't know if it was just some twisted game or something far darker, but I do know one thing. I never took another solitary road trip again. The highway stalker wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a warning. And no matter how far I go, I can still feel their presence just waiting in the dark. I'd always wanted a quiet life, away from the chaos of the city, and that's why I decided to move into a small house at the edge of a sleepy town. The place was perfect, modest, with a view of a peaceful forest and a small garden that needed a little TLC. It was exactly what I needed after years of hustle and stress. I packed my things, drove to the new house, and imagined how serene my life would be in this quiet place. At first, everything was as perfect as I had imagined. The neighbors, though few and far between, were friendly enough. There was an older couple who lived a few doors down, always willing to lend a hand, and a young man a few houses over who worked from home. But the house next to mine remained empty for weeks. No sign of life, no moving trucks, just an old, weathered house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. I didn't think much of it. Some houses in the area were abandoned or in the process of being sold. But then one day I noticed a light on in the window of the house next door. It was late in the evening and I hadn't seen any cars pull up or any sign of activity. Curious, I looked out the window again, trying to make out anything in the shadows. That's when I saw someone standing by the window. A figure still as stone, just watching the house. I couldn't make out details, but the shape of a person was unmistakable. I tried to shrug it off, but something about the stillness felt unsettling. I went to bed, but the image of the figure lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from across the yard. The next day, I went about my usual routine, but the strange presence of the figure bothered me. I glanced at the house next door more than once, half expecting to see someone standing by the window again. But there was nothing. The house seemed as silent and abandoned as ever. Then, 3 days later, I saw the person again. I was out in my garden, pulling weeds, when I noticed a shadow from the corner of my eye. The figure was standing at the same window, still and silent, just watching. This time I didn't look away. I watched the figure carefully, trying to make out any details. The person didn't move, didn't shift or react. It was as if they were frozen, their gaze locked on me through the glass. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and for the first time, I wondered if something was seriously wrong with the house next door. That night, I decided to knock on the door. I reasoned that maybe the house wasn't abandoned after all, and perhaps the person inside was just new to the area. Maybe I was overreacting, imagining things because of the quiet surroundings. I walked over to the house, my steps slow and deliberate. The door was old and creaked as I knocked. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. After a few moments of standing there, I decided to leave. Maybe they were out. The next morning, I saw the figure again. It was standing at the same window, staring. This time I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to call the police. I told them that there was someone in the house next door, standing motionless at the window. It sounded strange, even to my own ears, but I figured it would be better to be safe than sorry. An officer arrived not long after. He knocked on the door of the house and waited. When there was no answer, he turned to me and nodded. "You said you saw someone inside, correct?" he asked. I nodded, feeling a bit foolish. The officer went to the back of the house and checked around. After a few minutes, he returned with a confused look on his face. "Ma'am, there's no one here," he said. "There's no sign of anyone having lived here for years. The utilities are all off. This place has been abandoned for a while." I blinked in disbelief. But I saw someone. I saw them standing at the window, I swear. The officer's expression softened. "We'll look into it, ma'am, but I think you might be seeing things. The house has been empty for a while." I felt silly and embarrassed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. That night, I stayed in, keeping my lights off and the curtains drawn, hoping to forget the strange experience. But as I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside, a faint sound like the creak of a door opening. I sat up, straining to listen. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police again. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong. When the officer arrived, he did a quick sweep of the house and yard, but found nothing unusual. They checked the area for signs of trespassing, but nothing. The house next door was still empty, completely abandoned. The next day, the neighbor's house was quiet again, no figures in the windows. The officer had chalked it all up to stress or my overactive imagination, but I knew something wasn't right. I started to avoid the house, pretending that the strange experiences never happened. But deep down, I could never forget the figure in the window. And in the stillness of the night, I would sometimes hear creaking, just faint enough to make me wonder if someone, somehow, was still there. Weeks passed, and nothing out of the ordinary happened again. That was until one night, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my door. I went to the window hoping to see some explanation. A neighbor, a car, anything. But all I saw was a dark silhouette standing by the fence between my house and the empty one. It was the same figure, and this time it was smiling. It was a late autumn evening when I decided to take the back roads home after visiting an old friend in the city. The leaves had already fallen and the weather was cold, the kind of chill that gnaws at your bones. I always enjoyed these drives though. They were quiet, almost meditative, with the empty road stretching ahead like a long, uninterrupted trail. The only sounds were the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional gust of wind. The sun had already set when I turned onto the winding road that led through the forest. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating patches of the road ahead. I wasn't in a hurry, but the isolation of the stretch of highway always made me uneasy, especially when it was this late. Still, I pushed on. I was only about an hour from home, and the road was familiar enough to feel safe. As I drove, I noticed something up ahead. A figure standing by the side of the road, their thumb outstretched, waiting for a ride. It was strange, though. There was no car in sight, no sign of any other traffic. The person seemed out of place, almost too still for someone hoping to catch a ride. I slowed my car as I approached. The figure was a woman, tall, dressed in a dark coat, her hair dark and loose around her shoulders. Her face was obscured by the night, but I could see her eyes. There was something haunting about the way she stared at me, her gaze intense, almost pleading. For a moment, I hesitated. I didn't normally pick up hitchhikers. Something about it always made me uncomfortable. But there was something about this woman. She looked cold, and the road ahead was deserted. I felt a wave of sympathy and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just nodded, her face still shadowed under her hair. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as she slowly approached the car and opened the door. "I'm headed to town," she said in a soft, almost melodic voice. "It's too cold out here." I didn't want to be rude, and I really did feel sorry for her, so I gestured for her to get in. She did, settling in beside me, her presence oddly still and quiet. I glanced over at her, expecting to make some small talk, but there was an unsettling silence between us. Her face remained hidden in the shadows of the car, and I couldn't quite place why she made me feel so uneasy. For a few minutes, I tried to focus on the road, the engine purring steadily, but my gaze kept drifting back to her. Every time I looked at her, she seemed different. Her eyes, though dark, had an emptiness to them that unsettled me further. It felt like she wasn't really there. The air in the car grew heavy, and I began to feel suffocated by the silence. I wanted to break it, to say something, anything, but my throat felt tight. I glanced at her once again, and this time I noticed something strange. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, but they seemed almost too still, unnaturally rigid. "Are you okay?" I asked, unable to keep the unease out of my voice. She didn't respond right away, but then, with a slight shift in her posture, she spoke in a voice that sounded far too distant. "I'm fine. Just tired." I didn't press her further, but I felt the need to get her out of the car as soon as possible. I glanced at the road ahead, looking for any sign of other drivers, but there was nothing. No lights, no cars. Just the stretch of road, dark and empty. A few more miles passed in tense silence. The feeling in the car was thick, oppressive. I had to do something. "Where exactly are you headed?" I asked, hoping to gauge just how far off my route she was. I figured I could drive her to the next town, at least. Her answer came quickly, almost too quickly. "Take the next left. I live up that road." I looked at her, confused. There was no left turn for miles, and certainly no houses around here. This was the middle of nowhere. The next left was several miles ahead, and even then, there was nothing but trees and the winding road. "I'm not sure I know which left you mean. Are you sure it's this way?" I asked. She didn't respond. The silence in the car grew heavier again, more suffocating, and I could feel the weight of her gaze, even though I wasn't looking at her. The road stretched on, the darkness around us growing deeper. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My gut told me something was wrong, that I needed to get her out of the car. I pulled over to the side of the road, my headlights shining into the thick trees. "Here's good. You can get out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out strained. She didn't move at first. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, unmoving. I reached over and opened the door for her. "You can go now." It was when she got out that I realized something. She didn't walk away. Instead, she stood by the door, staring at me with that same intense gaze. It was like she was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. I looked at her in confusion, but when I glanced back up, she was gone. The road was empty, just as it had been when I first saw her. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself I was just tired. I told myself I imagined it. But when I looked out the passenger side window, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, on the side of the road, was the exact same figure. But this time she was standing at the edge of the woods, staring back at me from the shadows. I drove away fast, without a second thought. I never saw her again. The next morning, I called the local authorities, but they had no record of anyone matching her description. There was no one on the road that night, and certainly no one living anywhere near that stretch of highway. I don't know who or what she was, but I do know one thing. I will never stop on a lonely road again, no matter who's standing there. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small, inexpensive unit in an old building on the outskirts of town. The building wasn't in the best shape, but the price was right, and I was eager to settle into my new life. I had been living in a tiny studio for years, and the idea of having more space felt like a luxury. The apartment was simple: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small living room, and an oddly large bathroom. It was the bathroom that stood out the most, though, not for its size but for the peculiar door. It was the last door at the end of a narrow hallway, hidden away at the far end of the apartment. The moment I stepped into the place, I had noticed it. It wasn't like the other doors, plain, wooden, and functional, but an old, thick metal door like one you might find in a prison or a basement. I asked the landlord about it during the walkthrough. "Oh, that door? It leads to a storage room. Nothing special in there, really. Just some old furniture and junk. It's been locked for years. I'd advise you not to bother with it," she said, a little too quickly. Her tone, though casual, felt dismissive, like she was hiding something. I didn't think much of it at the time. The rent was cheap and everything else seemed perfect. I'd just been through a tough breakup and I was looking for a fresh start, a place where I could breathe. I moved in a few days later, quickly unpacking my things and immediately got into a routine. But there was something about that door. It was always there, staring at me from the hallway like it was waiting. I could hear it sometimes, creaking or tapping, as if something inside was shifting or moving. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the old building settling, the walls creaking. After all, nothing bad had happened. It was just a door, a harmless door. One night, after I had finished dinner and was getting ready to go to bed, I heard it again. A faint noise like something scraping against the inside of the door. A slow, deliberate dragging sound that sent a chill up my spine. I got up and walked to the hallway, my heart beating faster with each step. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering just inches from the cold, rusted handle. I had no reason to open it. The landlord had told me it was just an old storage room after all. But my curiosity gnawed at me, and the sound from behind the door was becoming more persistent. It was like something, or someone, was trying to get out. I turned the handle. The door didn't budge. It was locked, just as the landlord had said. But there was something wrong. It felt different, like the door was breathing. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, hoping to hear something more, anything that could explain the noise. That's when I heard it. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I leaned back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't be sure if I had really heard it, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was on the other side of that door. The next few days were a blur. I tried to focus on work, tried to get some sleep, but my thoughts kept returning to the door. The sounds, the whisper, the feeling that something was trapped behind it, waiting for me. That weekend, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to the hardware store and bought a lock-picking kit. I knew I shouldn't be doing this. The landlord had warned me to leave it alone, but I couldn't help myself. The door had become an obsession. I needed to know what was behind it. I returned to the apartment that afternoon, my fingers trembling as I set up my tools. I knelt in front of the door, carefully inserting the pins and turning the lock. It took longer than I expected, but eventually, with a quiet click, the door gave way. I stood there for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. Then I pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, so dark that I could barely make out anything at all. There was a musty smell like damp earth and old, forgotten things. My heart raced as I stepped into the room, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was a small room, barely big enough to fit a cot, a few old boxes, and a strange wooden crate in the corner. But it wasn't the room itself that terrified me. It was what I found inside. The crate. The wood was old and splintered, but it had been sealed shut with heavy, rusted nails. As I stepped closer, I felt an icy chill wash over me. I reached out, my fingers grazing the wood. And then the whispering started again. "Help me." I jumped back, my blood running cold. The whisper was clearer this time, louder, and it was coming from the crate. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath shallow and rapid. I backed away slowly, my mind racing, but my body frozen in place. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there. But before I could turn to run, I saw it. There, on the floor, written in chalk, scratched, clawed, and smeared across the stone, was a message. "Don't open it. She's still here." I screamed and stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. I ran out of the room, my heart racing in panic. I locked the door behind me, not caring if the landlord was going to be mad. I didn't care about anything but getting away from that room, that thing, that feeling. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The thought of what might be trapped behind that door haunted me. But more than that, the message, those words, kept replaying in my mind. She's still here. It's been 2 weeks since I opened the door. I haven't told anyone about what happened. I still hear the whispers sometimes, even when I'm alone in the apartment. I don't know what I let out. I don't know what's still here, but I can feel it. I can hear it, and I'm scared to leave because I'm not sure if the door is the only thing that's locked anymore. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I'd been working long hours, and the idea of escaping to a small cabin in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to recharge. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, and they had mentioned it was located on a remote stretch of land, surrounded by trees and snow-capped peaks. The thought of seclusion with no one around for miles felt like a dream. The weather forecast had been clear when I left the city, but by the time I reached the cabin, the sky had darkened. A heavy snowstorm had rolled in unexpectedly, and the winds had picked up. It was the kind of snowstorm that makes you feel like you're trapped inside a snow globe, with the world outside reduced to a blur of white. I made my way into the cabin, unloaded my bags, and started a fire in the fireplace. The crackling warmth was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. The cabin was small but cozy, with wooden beams and rustic furniture that gave it a charm I hadn't expected. I poured myself a drink and settled in for a quiet evening alone, enjoying the solitude. Around midnight, as the storm intensified, I heard something odd. A knock. Not from the front door, but from the back. It was faint, almost imperceptible against the howling winds, but it was there. I stood still for a moment, unsure if I had heard it correctly. Maybe it was just the wind, or the house settling. I'd been alone in remote places before, and the mind can play tricks in the quiet. But then there it was again. A soft, deliberate knock coming from the back door. I moved cautiously to the kitchen where the back door was. My mind raced. Who could be out there? I hadn't seen another car for miles when I arrived. And in this storm, it was madness to even think of driving. I stood by the door, peering out through the frosted window, but there was nothing. Just the swirling snow, the dark woods, and the empty landscape. I sighed, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. But then I noticed something, footprints in the snow leading up to the door. I froze. The prints were fresh, and they were large, too large to be from an animal. They led right up to the door, stopped, and then nothing. They just ended there, as if the person had vanished into thin air. My heart skipped a beat. I locked the door and made my way back to the living room, trying to ignore the rising sense of panic. There was no way anyone could have come all the way up here in this storm, and certainly not with those heavy, deliberate footsteps. I tried to convince myself that it was just some local who had wandered off the beaten path, or perhaps someone looking for shelter. But the snowstorm had intensified, and if they were out there, they'd be crazy to be wandering around in this weather. I decided to call the local sheriff, but my phone had no signal. It was a remote area, and I hadn't expected to get any reception, but it only added to the anxiety building inside me. I tried not to let it get to me, but the feeling of being watched crept over me, like invisible eyes were peering through the walls. I spent the next few hours pacing, staring out the window and trying to reassure myself. The storm raged outside, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. Every so often I thought I heard a sound, a scrape against the door or the faintest rustle in the trees, but I couldn't be sure if it was real or just the wind playing tricks. By the time the storm seemed to subside, the cabin was silent again. The snow had covered everything, erasing any trace of the footprints. It felt as though the strange occurrence had never happened. I tried to push it from my mind, telling myself that I was just imagining things. But the unease lingered. The next morning I decided to leave. The storm had mostly passed, but the roads would still be treacherous, and I didn't want to take any chances. As I packed up my things, I glanced out the window one last time. The world outside was blanketed in white, peaceful in its stillness. Then I noticed footprints, fresh ones. The same set of heavy, deliberate prints I had seen last night. They were outside the front of the cabin now, leading right up to the window where I was standing. I felt my blood run cold. I stepped back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. How could this be possible? Who was out there? Why hadn't I heard them approach? I grabbed my things, slammed the door behind me, and bolted for my car. The snow was still deep and the visibility was poor, but I didn't care. I couldn't leave fast enough. As I drove down the narrow, winding road that led to the main highway, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The thought that someone, or something, was following me made my hands tremble on the wheel. The woods surrounding the road were thick and dark, the branches of the trees swaying ominously in the wind. I made it back to town without incident, but the memory of those footprints stayed with me. Who had been out there? How had they gotten so close without me hearing them? And most terrifying of all, how had they vanished into thin air? I still don't know what happened that night. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. But every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I can't help but remember those footprints and the feeling of being watched. It's a terror that I can't shake, one that follows me like a shadow, always lurking just out of sight. I had just moved to a small, quiet town, looking for a fresh start after a chaotic few years. The decision to leave the city behind and settle in a place with fewer people and less noise felt like a welcome change. My new house was nestled on a corner lot, a modest two-story home surrounded by trees and quiet streets. The neighborhood was peaceful. No traffic, no commotion, just old houses and friendly faces. The first few days were blissfully uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, organizing, and getting used to the slower pace of life. The neighbors were kind, greeting me with warm smiles and brief chats as they passed by. There was one neighbor in particular, a man named Tom, who seemed to have lived in the neighborhood for years. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a rough, weathered face and an ever-present cane. Tom's house was next to mine, and he often sat on his porch watching the world go by. At first, I thought little of him, but over time, I started to notice something strange. Tom was always there. Every time I stepped outside, whether it was morning or evening, he was sitting on his porch, staring out at the street. He didn't seem to interact much with anyone, but his presence was constant. I'd wave at him occasionally, and he'd nod in return, but that was the extent of our communication. Still, it was odd. He was always there. It felt as though he never went inside. One evening, as I was bringing in my trash cans after the collection, I noticed something different. Tom wasn't sitting on his porch. I thought nothing of it at first. Maybe he was inside or running errands. But the next day he wasn't there either, or the day after that. I didn't think much about it at first. People come and go after all. Maybe he was away visiting family, or perhaps he was sick. But the days turned into a week, and still there was no sign of him. Then one evening I was sitting in my living room reading when I heard a faint sound coming from outside. A scratching noise like something dragging against the ground. I looked out the window, but there was no one around. The street was empty, the only movement coming from the trees swaying in the wind. But there it was again, scratching, dragging like someone was slowly making their way across the yard. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind. But the noise continued, growing louder, more persistent. It was coming from Tom's house. Curious, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, walking cautiously toward his yard. As I approached his house, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar, an unsettling crack in the otherwise silent house. The scratching sound was now accompanied by a soft shuffling, like someone moving in slow, deliberate steps. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to do. Something felt wrong. The door wasn't fully open, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I glanced around. No one was nearby. I felt the weight of the moment, as if the entire world had frozen. The trees seemed to loom over the street, casting long, thin shadows in the moonlight. My feet moved on their own, bringing me closer to the house. Before I could reach the door, I heard the shuffle again, this time louder. It came from inside, just behind the door. I took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, stale, like something had been left to rot for too long. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight as I made my way into the living room. There was no sign of Tom, but the house wasn't empty. It felt wrong, as though someone, or something had been living there recently. I moved cautiously through the house, calling out softly, "Tom, are you here?" No answer. I continued searching the house, feeling the unsettling chill growing with every step. The furniture was covered in sheets, dust had settled on every surface, and there were strange marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. When I reached the stairs, I hesitated. The scratchy, dragging sound was louder now, coming from the upstairs. I felt my heart race. I wanted to turn around, to leave the house and never come back, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I found myself climbing the stairs, step by step, the sounds growing louder, more frantic. At the top of the stairs, I found a door slightly ajar. The room was dark, and the air inside was suffocating, like it had been sealed off for years. But the sounds, they were coming from inside the room. I pushed the door open. There, in the corner of the room, sat Tom. He was slumped against the wall, his body unnaturally twisted, his face pale and sunken. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. The dragging sound had come from his cane, which lay on the floor beside him, scraping against the wood as if it had been moved by the slightest breeze. Tom's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His body twitched as if he was struggling to speak, to move. His hand reached out toward me, fingers curled in a desperate, pleading motion. Frozen in terror, I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran out of the house was Tom's hand, slowly reaching for me. But I could hear him calling, his voice a rasping whisper just beyond the door. I don't know what happened to Tom after that. I never saw him again. The house was abandoned for days, and eventually it was sold. The new owners came in as if nothing had happened. The neighborhood carried on and life went back to normal. But I know what I saw. I saw the man who had vanished, trapped in his own house. I don't know what happened to him or how he ended up like that. But every time I pass by that house, I can't shake the feeling that something is still inside, waiting. It had been a long, tiring day at work, and all I wanted was to return to my small apartment, curl up with a book, and forget about the chaos of the outside world. I'd been living in the city for only a few months, and while I was starting to adjust, the overwhelming noise and constant movement still felt suffocating at times. My apartment was located on the top floor of a rundown building at the edge of the city, where the streets were quieter, the buildings older, and the lights dimmer. The building wasn't the kind of place you typically want to live, but it was affordable, and at the time, that's all that mattered. I had gotten used to the creaks and groans of the structure, the flickering lights, and the occasional cold draft that slipped through the walls. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That night, after a quick dinner, I settled into my worn armchair by the window. The city was dark outside, the occasional car passing, but for the most part, the street below was empty. The stillness of the night was oddly comforting. I must have dozed off because when I awoke, it was well past midnight. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. My eyes shifted to the window. There was something about the darkness outside that seemed deeper, more oppressive than before. The usual street lights were dim, casting faint shadows on the pavement. Suddenly, I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then I heard it again. A quiet shuffling. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was too distinct, too deliberate to be the building. The footsteps were moving along the hallway just outside my door. I couldn't tell if they were coming toward me or away, but the silence that followed was deafening. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I strained to listen, my senses on high alert. It wasn't unusual for people to come and go in the building at odd hours, but the footsteps felt different, like they were lingering, as if the person outside was aware of my presence, but didn't want to be seen. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. No knock on the door, no call for attention. Just the shuffling, moving back and forth as if pacing. Minutes passed and I dared not move. The noise outside continued, relentless, as if whoever was out there was waiting for something. Maybe they were lost, maybe they were just passing through. I told myself that, but a growing unease gnawed at me. I had no way of knowing who it was or how long they'd been there. Finally, I stood up, my legs trembling. I took a deep breath and crept toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The shuffling had stopped. I hesitated, listening closely. All I could hear now was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. My pulse raced, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. With trembling hands, I opened the door. The hallway outside was empty, but the air felt different, thicker, colder. The dim light from the overhead bulb cast long shadows along the narrow corridor. I stepped out cautiously, glancing left and right, but there was no sign of anyone. It was then that I noticed it. At the far end of the hallway, there was a door slightly ajar, one that I knew had been sealed shut since I'd moved in. It led to an old storage room, long forgotten and unused. The door was never open. It had been locked when I arrived, but now it was open just a crack. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to go near it, but something compelled me to move closer. The footsteps had stopped, but there was an eerie stillness in the air now. My feet moved almost of their own accord, bringing me toward the door. As I reached the threshold, I paused, staring into the dark room beyond. There was nothing to see, just the usual dusty shelves and forgotten furniture bathed in shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then I heard it, so quiet I almost didn't hear it at first. A soft breath, a whisper in the dark. It wasn't my own. It was too slow, too deliberate. I backed away, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I saw something move from the corner of my eye. In the darkness, at the far end of the storage room, there was a figure. It was tall and thin, hunched over as if hiding in the shadows. I could barely make out its shape, but I saw enough to know that it wasn't supposed to be there. It was a person, or something pretending to be one. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, piercing through the darkness. I could hear the softest exhale, as if it was waiting for me to make a move. I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed down the hallway, loud and frantic. I slammed the door to my apartment shut, bolting it behind me. My hands were shaking as I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. I didn't sleep that night. In fact, I don't think I've ever slept soundly in that apartment again. In the morning, I checked the storage room. The door was shut tight, as if it had never been opened. I could find no trace of the figure, no signs of anything out of place. But I knew what I had seen. The next day, I packed my things. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with the memory of that figure in the darkness waiting for me. I moved out the following week. I didn't leave a note, didn't even say goodbye to the landlord. I just walked away. To this day, I still don't know who or what was in that room. But the silence that night was deafening, and I'll never forget the breath, the whisper, the feeling of being watched. It started like any other winter getaway, or so I thought. I was alone, a little cabin tucked away in the mountains, far from the bustling noise of city life. A weekend retreat, just me and the snow, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the wind howling through the pines. I had arrived earlier that afternoon. The weather was cold but manageable, a light dusting of snow on the ground, the mountains glistening in the fading light. The cabin itself was isolated, an old wooden structure with no electricity save for the small solar panel on the roof. The owner had warned me about potential power outages, but I wasn't worried. After all, it was supposed to be a peaceful escape. I had stocked up on food, blankets, and books. I was prepared for a couple of days of silence and solitude. By nightfall, the storm had started to pick up. The winds were howling, a fierce gust rattling the windows, and snow fell in sheets, turning the landscape outside into a white blur. My phone had no signal out here, but that didn't bother me. I had no intention of going anywhere. I settled into my routine, cooked a simple meal, curled up by the fire with a book. The world outside seemed to be closing in, as if the storm was swallowing everything around me. Around 9 p.m., I decided to call it a night. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard the phone ring. It was the first time it had made a sound all day, and my heart skipped a beat. I quickly grabbed the phone, surprised to see that it was receiving a call, even though I hadn't had any signal all day. I stared at the screen for a moment, my thumb hovering over the answer button. The number was unfamiliar, just a string of digits that didn't belong to anyone I knew. But something told me I should pick it up. I pressed the green button. "Hello?" I asked, my voice hesitant. For a moment, there was only static, a faint crackling sound in the background. And then, just as I was about to hang up, the voice came through. "You shouldn't be out there," a deep voice said, raspy, as if it had been trying to get through for some time. I froze. My heart began to race. Sounded wrong. The voice wasn't familiar, but the tone was unnervingly clear. "Who is this?" I asked, feeling a chill creeping up my spine. There was a long pause. The voice was low, as though the person on the other end was speaking from far away, yet there was something unnervingly close about it. "I told you," the voice said again, "you shouldn't be out there. Not tonight." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. "What do you mean? Who is this?" Another pause. The voice continued, this time with an eerie calmness. "The storm? It's not just a storm. It's coming for you." My hands went clammy. I glanced out the window at the swirling snow, the violent wind slamming against the glass. The storm had already been harsh, but now it felt different, like something more menacing lurked within it. "What the hell is this?" I whispered to myself. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer directly, but I could hear something else now, a faint sound in the background, almost like breathing. Then, without warning, the call disconnected. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank, just some idiot playing around. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than just a bad joke. I went to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain and peering into the white blur outside. The storm had intensified. The snow was falling in sheets, obscuring the world beyond the glass. I couldn't see anything, but the unease in my stomach grew stronger. And then it happened. A figure, dark and indistinct, appeared outside the cabin window. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I quickly stepped away from the window, my pulse racing. What was that? Was someone out there? I thought about going outside, but my feet were frozen to the floor, as if my body knew something my mind didn't want to acknowledge. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing. The room felt colder, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of minutes. I didn't want to be paranoid, but the voice on the phone, the figure outside the window, it all seemed to be part of something I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. I nearly jumped out of my skin as I grabbed it. This time, the number was blocked. I answered immediately, my hand trembling. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, just the same crackling noise from before. And then, faintly, I heard it, whispers, soft and unintelligible at first. As they grew clearer, my blood ran cold. "Run." The phone line went dead. I dropped the phone, my heart racing. I had no idea who was on the other end, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I rushed to the door, bolted it, and then checked every window, making sure they were all locked. I couldn't explain what was happening, but my gut told me to leave. I couldn't wait any longer. As I grabbed my things, I heard something again, a soft knock on the door, followed by a voice that sent ice through my veins. "You can't leave." I froze, staring at the door, too afraid to move. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my mind spinning. I had no idea what was out there, but I knew one thing: I had to get away from this cabin. before whatever it was came inside. And as I turned to flee, the storm outside grew louder, almost as if it was trying to swallow the world whole. I had always enjoyed the solitude of nature, and this time I thought I was prepared for anything. A solo camping trip in the middle of nowhere, just me in the wild. I chose a remote area far from civilization. No cell signal, no noise from the city. It was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of everyday life, a retreat into the peaceful embrace of the wilderness. The journey there had been smooth, the road winding deeper into the forest as I left the last signs of modern life behind. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was already starting to dip behind the towering trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. There were no other campers around, just the quiet hum of the wind through the leaves and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, watched the stars appear as darkness settled in, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was just as I had imagined, serene, isolated, and calm. But that calm would soon be shattered. As the hours stretched on, the wind picked up, growing louder and more erratic. A storm seemed to be brewing on the horizon. By midnight, the wind was howling and the trees were creaking under its force. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to ignore the rising tension in the air. The storm outside raged, but the tent held firm against the wind. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A rustling sound, soft at first, but then growing louder. It came from somewhere outside my tent, just beyond the edge of my hearing. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind, nor was it an animal. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and not the natural pace of a creature moving through the woods. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. I waited, listening for more, but everything went silent. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping over me, telling myself it was just my imagination, the wind playing tricks on me. But the longer I sat there in the darkness, the more convinced I became that I wasn't alone. I cautiously unzipped the tent and stuck my head out, peering into the blackness of the woods. There was nothing, just the sway of the trees and the occasional flash of lightning in the distance. The wind had calmed a little, but the storm was still strong. I saw no sign of anything out of place, but when I turned to go back inside, I froze. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. His silhouette was outlined against the storm, but he didn't move. He was just standing there, staring at me. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I rushed to zip up the tent. I locked the door, my mind racing. Was it someone else out camping nearby? Or was I being watched by someone who didn't belong in these woods? The minutes felt like hours. I lay there in the dark, listening for any sounds, footsteps, voices, anything. But there was only the howling wind and the distant crack of thunder. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the figure, that it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard something else. A faint noise, like a whisper, coming from the darkness outside my tent. It wasn't a voice I could understand, just low murmurs carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I held my breath, straining to listen. The murmurs grew louder, and then all at once they stopped. I waited for the sound to return, but there was nothing. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to hang over the woods, thick and suffocating. And then I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. They were closer this time, much closer. I could feel my pulse quicken as I pressed myself into the corner of the tent, trying to make myself as small and unnoticed as possible. The footsteps stopped. I could feel the presence outside, like something, or someone, was just standing there watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body was frozen in place. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of fabric brushing against the tent. Something was touching it, running its hand along the outer fabric as if trying to feel its way around. My blood ran cold. Whoever, or whatever, was outside, it wasn't just passing through. It was lingering, searching. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. The wind picked up again, howling louder than before, and the sound of the footsteps faded into the distance. But I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. It felt like hours before the storm finally quieted down, and the figure, if it had even been there, seemed to vanish. By morning, the woods were still and calm, the air thick with the remnants of the storm. I unzipped my tent cautiously, half expecting to find something, or someone, waiting outside. But there was nothing. No signs of anyone else. The ground was undisturbed, the only marks left were from the storm. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a late-night wanderer. I packed up quickly, leaving the campsite as quickly as I could. The forest felt different now, darker, more oppressive, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I didn't look back as I walked away, but I could still hear the faint whisper of footsteps in the distance. Whoever or whatever it hadn't gone far, and I wasn't sure I would ever know what it truly was. I was traveling through the Midwest, making my way across the vast, empty stretches of land when I happened upon a town that wasn't even on my map. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, the GPS had gone haywire, and soon I found myself on a narrow, winding road leading into a sleepy little settlement that seemed to be stuck in time. The houses were old, their windows dark, the streets empty. There were no signs of life anywhere. No stores, no people, just a few weathered buildings along the roadside. I figured I'd stop for a bit, stretch my legs, and perhaps grab a bite to eat. I hadn't seen another car for miles, so it seemed like a quiet place to rest. The town had an eerie stillness, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the cracked windows of a nearby store. I parked my car near what seemed to be a local diner, its neon sign flickering weakly above the door. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the door was open. I stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing with a harsh, jarring clang. The smell of old coffee lingered in the air, and the wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I walked deeper into the diner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls. There was no answer, but I noticed a figure sitting at the counter. A man, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were old-fashioned, almost like he'd stepped out of a different time. He didn't look up when I entered, and I couldn't help but feel a slight shiver run down my spine. I hesitated for a moment before approaching him. "Excuse me," I said, my voice awkward in the empty space. "I'm just passing through. I was hoping to get something to eat." The man didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his hands folded neatly in front of him. It was as if he hadn't heard me, or perhaps he was waiting for something. I began to feel uncomfortable, but before I could leave, the man turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes dark and deep, almost as if they were hiding something. His gaze held mine for a long moment, and I felt the unsettling weight of it. "Sit down," he said, his voice raspy. "Food's still warm. You're going to need it." I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. The diner seemed deserted, and the man's words didn't make sense. Still, the thought of food seemed appealing. I wasn't about to argue with an old man in an empty diner, so I sat down on one of the stools. A plate of what looked like scrambled eggs and bacon sat in front of me. I didn't remember the man serving it, nor did I hear him get up to prepare it. But it was hot, and the smell was intoxicating, so I decided to eat. As I took my first bite, I noticed something strange about the food. It tasted odd. Not bad, just odd, like something was mixed into it that didn't belong. I pushed the thought away and continued eating, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the more I ate, the more the feeling of unease gnawed at me. I wouldn't eat too much of that, the old man said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. You don't want to be here too long. Not tonight. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. There was something in his voice, something cold and cryptic, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowly put the fork down, trying to keep my composure. What do you mean? I asked, my voice tight. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned back to face the wall, his gaze drifting to something beyond my line of sight. He muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. Things aren't what they seem in this town, he said after a long pause. They never are. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask more questions, but something about the man's strange behavior made me hesitate. I looked around the diner again, trying to ignore the rising sense of dread building in my chest. Just then, I heard the sound of footsteps outside, slow and measured, as if someone was walking deliberately toward the diner. I turned my head toward the door, but no one entered. The bell above the door jingled again, but no one appeared. Who's out there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made my heart race. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. Leave, he said, his voice low and urgent. No, it's too late. You shouldn't have come. Before I could respond, I heard the door swing open, the bell ringing loudly. A shadow stood in the doorway, tall and thin, obscured by the darkness outside. The figure didn't step into the diner but remained just beyond the threshold, watching us. My pulse quickened and my instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, trapped by the old man's grip and the presence lurking in the doorway. The man at the counter didn't move either. He just kept staring at the shadow, his face grim. Finally, the figure outside spoke, its voice cold and hollow, carrying across the still air. You shouldn't have stayed, the voice said, echoing strangely in the empty diner. Suddenly, the air in the room grew thick, the temperature dropping as if a heavy weight had settled over me. The man's grip tightened, his nails digging into my skin. Go, he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. It's coming for you. Before I could react, I pulled away from him and bolted for the door. The figure outside took a step forward, but as I stumbled out into the night, the door slammed shut behind me, and the air grew still once more. I didn't dare look back. I ran until I reached my car, started the engine, and sped out of the town without a second thought. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The town I passed through was gone the next morning. There were no signs of the diner, no roads leading to it. I couldn't find it again even when I tried. It was as if the town had never existed. All I know is this: I was warned, and something, or someone, was waiting for me. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A quiet weekend getaway in the mountains, far away from the noise of the city. Just me, a small cabin, and the serenity of the wilderness. The plan was simple: hike, read, cook some simple meals, and completely disconnect from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the rush of the nearby stream. The cabin I rented was tucked away in a remote part of the forest, accessible only by a winding dirt road that led into the heart of the mountains. The first day went exactly as planned. The cabin was cozy, with a stone fireplace and wooden walls that smelled like pine. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and I spent the afternoon hiking up a trail that led to a stunning viewpoint overlooking the valley below. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting behind the peaks, casting a warm glow over the landscape. That evening, I cooked a simple dinner, read for a bit by the fire, and went to bed early. There was something so calming about the solitude, and I was eager to enjoy a restful night. But that peacefulness didn't last. At around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone ringing. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen a single signal for miles, and I had no idea how my phone was even receiving a call. I checked the screen. It was a blocked number. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was just some strange automated call. But something made me pick up. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse from sleep. For a moment, there was only static on the other end, the crackling of a bad connection. I could barely make out any sound at all. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard a voice, a deep, gravelly voice, slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here." My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, clutching the phone tighter. I had no idea who this was, but the tone of the voice was chilling. It sounded as if the person on the other end was standing just outside my cabin, his words carrying an unsettling weight. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "Who is this?" There was a long pause before the voice spoke again, softer this time, almost as if it was whispering. "You shouldn't have come to the cabin. Not tonight. Not alone." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around the dimly lit cabin, feeling the air grow heavier. I wasn't sure why, but something about the voice made the space around me feel wrong. "Who is this?" I demanded again, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "What do you want?" There was a sharp, almost mocking chuckle on the other end. Then the voice spoke once more, this time with an edge of menace. "You'll see. Stay inside. Don't open the door." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, the screen blank. The room was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. Maybe it was some kind of prank, a wrong number, or a glitch in the system. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more my sense of unease grew. I tried to call the number back, but there was no signal. The call had come from nowhere, and now it seemed like the phone had gone completely dead. I set the device down, my palms sweaty. I told myself to calm down, that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, faint at first, but growing louder. A sound from outside the cabin. A soft scraping noise like something dragging across the ground. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. I stood frozen, listening intently, trying to figure out what it was. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Then I heard something else, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. They were coming closer. I could feel my pulse quickening as I reached for the flashlight on the table next to my bed. I turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing outside the window. No movement. No sign of anyone. The steps had stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but the night remained still. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I knew I shouldn't open the door. The voice on the phone had told me not to. But curiosity, along with a growing sense of dread, compelled me to get up and check the door. I stood near the front door, my hand hovering over the knob. I glanced through the peephole, but there was nothing there. No figure. No shadow. Just the darkness of the forest surrounding me. I slowly turned the handle. Suddenly, the door burst open. The wind howled through the gap, pushing the door wide open with a force that made me stagger back. Outside there was no one, but the air felt colder now, a biting chill that pierced right through me. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and backed away, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was out there? That was when I heard it again, the voice. This time it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside the cabin, from just behind me. Too late, it whispered, and I froze, the blood draining from my face. I spun around, but there was nothing. Only the empty cabin, the flickering light of the fire, and the oppressive weight of silence. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the knowledge that whatever had called me, whatever had been outside, was still there, waiting. The morning light eventually came, casting a pale glow over the cabin. I left first thing, packed my things in a frenzy, and drove away without looking back. To this day, I don't know who called me that night or what was waiting outside, but I can't shake the feeling that the cabin in those mountains was never meant to be a place of peace. And whatever it was, it's still out there. I had just finished a long week of work and decided to drive out of the city for a quick weekend retreat. It was late Friday evening and I needed to clear my head, so I set off on a drive into the countryside, thinking I could unwind with a peaceful night away from the chaos of the city. I had planned to stay at a small bed and breakfast I had booked in advance, about 2 hours away from the city. It wasn't a difficult drive, but I had never been down this road before. The night was damp, with a heavy rain falling steadily as I left the city limits. The windshield wipers worked furiously to keep up, and the headlights sliced through the thick fog that had settled over the road. The further I drove, the fewer cars I saw until the highway was completely empty. No street lights, just the sound of my tires against the wet road and the constant thrum of rain hitting the car. Around the halfway point, I took a wrong turn. I knew I had missed a sign, but the rain and poor visibility made it hard to tell where I was exactly. The road narrowed and the trees on both sides closed in around me, their branches dripping with water. I didn't panic. After all, it wasn't a long detour, and I figured I'd eventually come to a familiar road or maybe even a sign. But then the road started to feel off. The further I went, the darker it got, and the more desolate the surroundings seemed. It wasn't just the weather or the isolation. It felt like something was wrong, something that I couldn't put my finger on. The GPS was no help. It had started glitching a few miles back, losing signal in the dense forest. I tried to stay calm, but anxiety began to gnaw at me. The rain turned into a downpour, and the visibility became nearly non-existent. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The headlights of my car reflected off the wet pavement, making everything look eerie, like a scene from a horror film. I rounded a bend in the road and noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It startled me, but I quickly assumed it was just someone stranded. There weren't many houses around here, but maybe this person was walking to the nearest one. I slowed down as I neared the figure, and that's when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The person wasn't moving. They stood absolutely still, facing away from the road, their bodies stiff as if frozen in place. For a moment, I considered stopping to ask if they needed help, but something in my gut told me not to. I couldn't explain it, but the situation felt wrong. I accelerated past the figure, glancing in the rearview mirror, but the person was still standing there, perfectly still. It was an unsettling sight. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just some strange person out in the rain. But that feeling of unease lingered. I drove for another 10 minutes, the rain pounding harder, when I noticed something strange. A set of headlights appeared behind me. This was odd, especially considering how desolate the road had been. I couldn't make out the car's shape due to the rain, but I saw the lights in my rearview mirror, steadily gaining on me. I thought it was just another driver, maybe someone who had passed the figure I saw earlier, but the car stayed behind me even as I sped up. A sense of dread started to crawl up my spine. The road was narrow with no place to pull over, so I kept going, trying to push the discomfort away. But the car didn't pass me. Instead, it matched my speed exactly, staying a few feet behind me no matter how fast I went. I could barely see the vehicle through the mist of rain and fog, but I knew it was there, lingering in the distance. The road twisted and turned, and at one point I glanced into my side mirror, expecting to see the car still behind me. To my horror, the headlights were gone. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. I waited for a few seconds, trying to get my bearings, but the road remained empty. The car had vanished. I turned off the engine, trying to catch my breath. I sat there for a while, just listening to the rain hitting the car. I wanted to get out and check around, but something told me not to. It was an isolated stretch of road, and even if I saw something, what was I going to do? I was completely alone. I decided to keep driving. I couldn't afford to stay on that road any longer, not with that feeling gnawing at me. But as soon as I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, The headlights reappeared in my mirror. This time they were closer. The car was right behind me again. I began to panic. I pressed my foot down harder on the accelerator, trying to put distance between myself and the car, but it stayed right there, maintaining a steady pace. No matter how fast I drove, no matter how many turns I took, the car was there. I couldn't hear the engine and I couldn't see the car's shape, just the headlights, bright and relentless. It was as if the vehicle was some phantom shadow, tracking my every move. Then a horrifying thought hit me. What if the car wasn't behind me at all? What if it was something else entirely? I tried to force myself to calm down, telling myself that it was probably just some other driver in a hurry, but the thought of that cold, empty road with no one around was overwhelming. I didn't want to know what was behind me. Just as I was about to take another sharp turn, the headlights blinked out, disappearing altogether. I could still feel the weight of something following me, even though the rearview mirror was clear. My pulse was racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. When I finally reached the bed and breakfast, exhausted and shaken, I found that the lights were out, and the place looked abandoned. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside, hoping to find some comfort in the warmth of the room. But as I entered, I froze in place. On the kitchen counter was a single wet shoe, perfectly placed, as though someone had just taken it off and left it there. I never found out who or what had been following me that night. The bed and breakfast had no record of any other guests, and when I asked around about the road I'd taken, no one seemed to know it. The car, the strange figure, and the footsteps on the wet road remained a mystery I could never quite shake off. All I knew for sure was that sometimes there are roads you don't take, and sometimes things follow you home, whether you're ready for them or not. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me in the woods. I needed time away from the constant buzz of city life, away from the distractions and demands. A friend had recommended a secluded cabin up in the mountains, deep in a remote part of the forest where no one could bother me. I had seen the pictures online, a cozy wooden cabin with a fireplace, a few windows overlooking a valley, surrounded by towering trees. The location seemed perfect. Quiet, isolated, peaceful. The drive to the cabin was longer than expected. I had to take winding mountain roads, and the further I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No gas stations, no other cars. By the time I arrived, the sky had already turned gray, and the last rays of daylight were fading behind the peaks. The air felt thick and heavy, and the wind howled through the trees as I unloaded my things from the car. The cabin itself was just as charming as the photos had promised. Inside, there was a firewood stack beside the hearth, an old-fashioned stove, and a few vintage rugs scattered on the wooden floors. A small kitchen, a bedroom in the back, and a porch that overlooked a narrow creek. The isolation felt peaceful at first. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the evening getting settled in, unpacking my bags, and cooking a simple meal. The rain started soon after, heavy and persistent, tapping against the windows. I thought about taking a walk, but the weather seemed to make everything feel more distant, more alone. So I sat by the fire, reading and drinking a cup of tea, letting the world outside fall away. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the fire, and the wind howled outside, but it felt peaceful. But as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I began to feel watched. I couldn't explain it, but I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside in the rain. I told myself it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it. A soft thud, followed by a scrape against the cabin wall. It was faint at first, so I brushed it off as the wind or maybe an animal outside. But the sound repeated, and this time it was closer, too close. My heart started to race. I got out of bed and crept toward the window, pulling back the curtains just a little. I expected to see nothing but rain and dark trees. Instead, my eyes were drawn to something else. A figure stood just outside the window. A shadow barely visible through the rain-soaked glass, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was standing there facing the cabin. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I couldn't make out the details, just the silhouette. It was a tall figure, unmoving, as if it was staring directly at me. I quickly pulled back from the window and backed away from the wall. My mind raced. Could it be someone who lived nearby, someone just passing by? But the nearest house was miles away. No one should have been out here. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, the rain playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to confront whatever was out there. Instead, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I called my friend who had recommended the cabin. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number. It rang, but there was no answer. I left a quick voicemail telling him that I thought something was outside, that I was scared. After that, I tried to call the local authorities, but there was no reception, no signal. I paced the cabin for what felt like an hour, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek outside again. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it through the window. The light cut through the dark, and for a moment, I could see the outline of the figure again. But something was different this time. The figure was closer, much closer than before. It was now standing just a few feet from the window, its features still unclear, but the shape of its body was more defined. The shadow had grown more solid, more menacing. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and my phone, rushing to the door. But before I could open it, I heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. Slowly. It was as if someone was trying to get in. My mind raced. There was no way anyone could have made it around the back of the cabin without me hearing them. How had they gotten so close? I froze. The door handle rattled again, and I could hear a low scraping sound, like fingernails dragging against wood. I knew I had to act fast. I ran to the back of the cabin and tried to find another way out. The back door, however, was locked. Every window was sealed shut, every exit obstructed by thick rain and mud. There was nowhere to go. Suddenly, a sharp sound pierced the air, a loud crack, followed by the faintest sound of something heavy hitting the floor inside the cabin. I turned back to the main room. In the dark, I thought I saw movement, an image so fleeting that I wasn't sure I had seen it at all. But there was a sudden flash, like a photo had been taken, and then everything went silent. I tried to leave the cabin, but when I opened the door, I found the entire scene outside completely different. The rain had stopped and the trees were still, but the cabin was no longer in the forest. It was as if I had entered a completely different place. The shadows were deeper, the atmosphere suffocating, and I realized with a growing sense of dread that I was trapped. In the days that followed, I did everything I could to find out more about the cabin, but the place didn't exist on any map. There was no record of the rental. The owner's contact information had vanished, and I never received a response to my desperate calls for help. I've never gone back to the cabin, and I never will. But the image of that figure, and the lingering feeling that I had seen something I wasn't meant to, still haunts me. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see the silhouette standing outside the window, staring, waiting, and watching. It seemed like the perfect escape. A remote island off the coast, completely isolated, far from the distractions of daily life. I had booked a stay at a small, historic lodge on the island, eager to disconnect from the world for a few days. The photos had shown a beautiful, rustic cabin with an incredible view of the ocean. The island was accessible only by a small ferry, and there were no other tourists at the time of my visit. It was exactly what I needed, a chance to unwind and recharge in solitude. The island itself was stunning. As soon as I stepped off the ferry, I felt a sense of quiet, a stillness that was almost too perfect. The air smelled salty, fresh, and a little wild. There were no other signs of human life, except for the lodge and a few old walking paths that wound through dense woods and along the cliffs. The entire island felt like a secret place, untouched by time or people. I arrived at the lodge in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The lodge was small, but it had a warm, inviting atmosphere with old wooden beams, a crackling fire, and the scent of aged wood in the air. The owner, an older man named Simon, welcomed me and gave me a quick tour of the place. He was quiet and seemed a bit distant, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He mentioned that the island had been his family's property for generations and that very few people ever visited. In fact, he seemed almost relieved that I was there alone. After a brief chat, Simon left me to settle in for the evening, mentioning that he would be leaving for a few days to visit a neighboring island for supplies. "You'll be perfectly safe," he said, his eyes lingering a little too long on me. "It's a quiet place. You won't see anyone else until I return." I spent the evening by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as the night grew darker, I began to feel a subtle unease, something I couldn't place. It was as though the island itself was watching me. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the isolation and the silence playing tricks on my mind. But then, around midnight, I heard something. At first, it was a faint noise, almost imperceptible, a soft tapping like someone knocking on a door. But the door was shut and I was alone. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the wind or the house settling. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, and it seemed to come from the direction of the small window overlooking the sea. I froze, straining to listen. Then came the scratching. Something was scraping along the window frame, a long, slow sound that sent a shiver down my spine. My heart started to pound in my chest. I quickly stood up and approached the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly, but there was nothing outside. The view was empty, just the dark, swirling ocean under the moonlight. I checked the rest of the cabin. Locked doors, closed windows, but everything was secure. The night air was chilly, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was louder than usual, making it hard to hear anything else. But the scratching continued. Now it was coming from the walls themselves, a faint but persistent sound that felt too human to be natural. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an animal, a raccoon or something similar, but it felt wrong. It felt deliberate, like something was trying to get in. I locked the doors and turned off all the lights, hoping the darkness would somehow help me feel safe. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The next morning, I woke up late, still shaken from the night before. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The island was breathtaking in the daylight, with the sun shining off the water and the cliffs towering high above me. I walked along the path near the beach, taking in the beauty of the place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence of the island was deafening. As I wandered, I noticed something odd. There were footprints along the shore, large and heavy, leading from the water and disappearing into the woods. They were fresh, too fresh for the tide to have washed them away. I followed the tracks, heart pounding, my mind racing with questions. Why was there someone else on the island? The footprints led to a small, overgrown trail that wound through the trees. I hesitated, but curiosity pushed me forward. As I walked deeper into the woods, the air seemed to grow colder and the trees thickened, blocking out the sun. The silence here was oppressive, unnaturally quiet. I could feel my skin prickling with unease. And then I saw it. A small, dilapidated shack hidden among the trees. It looked ancient, barely standing, with its door hanging off its hinges. The windows were cracked and the roof was covered in moss and vines. The footprints led directly to the shack. I approached cautiously, every nerve in my body alert. My heart was racing. Whoever, or whatever, had been here was close. I slowly pushed open the door. The inside was dark, but I could make out the shape of old furniture, piles of rotting wood, and a musty smell that hit me like a wave. And there, in the center of the room, was a piece of furniture that made my blood run cold. An old rocking chair. It was rocking. Slowly, steadily. I rushed out of the shack, my mind reeling. Something had been in there, someone or something. I ran back toward the lodge, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I neared the lodge, I looked around, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. That night, I locked myself in my room, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the old building made me jump. I kept hearing the same scraping noise, the same soft tapping from outside. But I couldn't bring myself to look. The next morning, Simon returned, and I tried to tell him what had happened. The noises, the footprints, the shack. But he only smiled and shook his head. "The island plays tricks on people," he said, his voice low and distant. "You're the only one here, and you'll stay that way. The island likes its solitude." When I left a few days later, I tried to leave the island behind. But the images of the shack, the rocking chair, and the unsettling presence I felt in the woods never left me. I tried to reach out to Simon again, but his contact information was gone. The lodge, the ferry service, even the island itself, it was as if they had never existed. I can't explain what I saw on that island. But I know one thing for sure. There are places in this world that are meant to be left alone. And sometimes the things that live there don't want visitors. It started like any other long drive home. I had been working in a city a few hours away from my small, quiet town, and I was exhausted. I had left late, hoping to make it back before midnight, but the weather was getting worse, and I found myself on an unfamiliar stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. It was dark, and the rain had started coming down in heavy sheets, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The road was empty, no other cars in sight, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I was already feeling drained, my eyelids heavy from the long day, when I saw something up ahead, a figure in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was an illusion, a trick of the rain and the headlights. But as I got closer, I could see it was a person standing perfectly still, right in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes, heart leaping into my throat. There was nowhere to go, no shoulder, no way to swerve around them. I stopped just a few feet away, and the figure didn't move. I rolled down my window slightly, straining to see. The figure was a man, drenched in the rain, wearing a long coat. His face was hidden by the shadows of his hood, but he was staring directly at me, unmoving, as though waiting for me to do something. I hesitated, then leaned out slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" I called. He didn't respond. His eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, cold and unblinking. For a moment, I thought about getting out of the car, but something stopped me. There was a strange, unsettling energy in the air. I felt like whatever was happening was wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. After a long, awkward silence, the figure suddenly stepped aside, still without a word, and motioned for me to pass. I didn't want to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. So I slowly drove past, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror to check if he was still there. The man was standing by the side of the road, still watching, until he was swallowed up by the rain. I tried to brush off the encounter, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The weather had only gotten worse, and I had no choice but to keep driving. I wanted to get home as quickly as possible, but every mile felt like it took forever. The road was long and empty, and the rain was relentless. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop, a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another car, but the more I looked, the more I realized that the car behind me was much too close. I couldn't see the make or model, just the blinding headlights right behind me. I sped up, hoping to get away, but the car matched my speed, staying right on my tail. The pressure of the situation was overwhelming. I could feel the tension building as the car stayed so close that I could almost feel its presence. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing, no one in the driver's seat. My heart raced as the car seemed to get even closer, practically riding my bumper. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a hitchhiker, maybe someone else who had seen the man in the road and was just as scared as I was. But no matter how fast I drove, the car stayed on my tail. I took a sharp turn off the highway into a side road, hoping to lose them. To my surprise, the car followed. It wasn't just that it stayed behind me, it mirrored my every move like it knew exactly where I was going. I turned again and the car turned right after me, never breaking its pattern. At this point, I was terrified. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing: something wasn't right. I pulled into an abandoned gas station, hoping I could get out of the car and maybe even find someone to help. I parked quickly and shut off the engine, watching the car approach. But as it got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The driver's side window was down, but there was no one in the seat. The car stopped a few feet from mine, and for a moment, everything was silent. My eyes were locked on the empty seat, and then I saw movement, shadows shifting behind the windshield. Someone was in the car, just out of view. The feeling of being watched, that same cold pressure, was unbearable. I had no idea how long I sat there, frozen in place, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I started the car and slammed the pedal to the floor, speeding away, my tires screeching on the wet asphalt. But when I glanced back in the rearview mirror, I saw the car in the distance, still following. It didn't matter how far I drove, it kept tailing me as though it would never let me go. For the next few hours, I drove in a daze, constantly checking the mirrors, my heart thundering in my chest. The rain showed no sign of letting up, and every turn I made only seemed to increase my fear. I wanted to stop, to call for help, but I had no idea who to reach out to. It felt like I was alone on this endless road, with whatever was following me gaining ground. Around 3 a.m., exhausted and nearing the edge of my breaking point, I turned down a narrow road that seemed to lead nowhere. It was barely lit by the occasional street lamp, but it was empty. No cars, no signs of life. The headlights behind me seemed to fade, slowly, as if the car had stopped following. I took the next exit, winding through the quiet streets of a small town, and pulled into a brightly lit gas station. When I checked my rearview mirror one last time, I saw no headlights in the distance. No car. No figure. Just the empty, wet road. I spent the rest of the night at the gas station, terrified to drive any further. The following morning, I returned to the highway, but there was no sign of the car, no strange figures, no unsettling presence. It was as if the entire night had been some kind of nightmare, a figment of my overactive mind. But even now, I can't explain it. I still don't know who that man was or why the car followed me so relentlessly. The only thing I know for certain is that someone was out there, and I'm not sure if it was ever really gone. It started like any other long drive home. I had been working in a city a few hours away from my small, quiet town, and I was exhausted. I had left late, hoping to make it back before midnight, but the weather was getting worse, and I found myself on an unfamiliar stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. It was dark, and the rain had started coming down in heavy sheets, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The road was empty, no other cars in sight, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I was already feeling drained, my eyelids heavy from the long day, when I saw something up ahead, a figure in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was an illusion, a trick of the rain and the headlights. But as I got closer, I could see it was a person standing perfectly still, right in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes, heart leaping into my throat. There was nowhere to go, no shoulder, no way to swerve around them. I stopped just a few feet away and the figure didn't move. I rolled down my window slightly, straining to see. The figure was a man, drenched in the rain, wearing a long coat. His face was hidden by the shadows of his hood, but he was staring directly at me, unmoving, as though waiting for me to do something. I hesitated, then leaned out slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" I called. He didn't respond. His eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, cold and unblinking. For a moment, I thought about getting out of the car, but something stopped me. There was a strange, unsettling energy in the air. I felt like whatever was happening was wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. After a long, awkward silence, the figure suddenly stepped aside, still without a word, and motioned for me to pass. I didn't want to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. So I slowly drove past, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror to check if he was still there. The man was standing by the side of the road, still watching until he was swallowed up by the rain. I tried to brush off the encounter, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The weather had only gotten worse and I had no choice but to keep driving. I wanted to get home as quickly as possible, but every mile felt like it took forever. The road was long and empty and the rain was relentless. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop, a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was just another car, but the more I looked, the more I realized that the car behind me was much too close. I couldn't see the make or model, just the blinding headlights right behind me. I sped up, hoping to get away, but the car matched my speed, staying right on my tail. The pressure of the situation was overwhelming. I could feel the tension building as the car stayed so close that I could almost feel its presence. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing, no one in the driver's seat. My heart raced as the car seemed to get even closer, practically riding my bumper. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a hitchhiker, maybe someone else who had seen the man in the road and was just as scared as I was. But no matter how fast I drove, the car stayed on my tail. I took a sharp turn off the highway into a side road, hoping to lose them. To my surprise, the car followed. It wasn't just that it stayed behind me, it mirrored my every move like it knew exactly where I was going. I turned again and the car turned right after me, never breaking its pattern. At this point, I was terrified. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing: something wasn't right. I pulled into an abandoned gas station, hoping I could get out of the car and maybe even find someone to help. I parked quickly and shut off the engine, watching the car approach. But as it got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The driver's side window was down, but there was no one in the seat. The car stopped a few feet from mine, and for a moment, everything was silent. My eyes were locked on the empty seat, and then I saw movement, shadows shifting behind the windshield. Someone was in the car, just out of view. The feeling of being watched, that same cold pressure, was unbearable. I had no idea how long I sat there, frozen in place, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I started the car and slammed the pedal to the floor, speeding away, my tires screeching on the wet asphalt. But when I glanced back in the rearview mirror, I saw the car in the distance, still following. It didn't matter how far I drove, it kept tailing me as though it would never let me go. For the next few hours, I drove in a daze, constantly checking the mirrors, my heart thundering in my chest. The rain showed no sign of letting up, and every turn I made only seemed to increase my fear. I wanted to stop, to call for help, but I had no idea who to reach out to. It felt like I was alone on this endless road, with whatever was following me gaining ground. Around 3 a.m., exhausted and nearing the edge of my breaking point, I turned down a narrow road that seemed to lead nowhere. It was barely lit by the occasional street lamp, but it was empty, no cars, no signs of life. The headlights behind me seemed to fade, slowly, as if the car had stopped following. I took the next exit, winding through the quiet streets of a small town, and pulled into a brightly lit gas station. When I checked my rearview mirror one last time, I saw no headlights in the distance. No car, no figure, just the empty, wet road. I spent the rest of the night at the gas station, terrified to drive any further. The following morning, I returned to the highway, but there was no sign of the car, no strange figures, no unsettling presence. It was as if the entire night had been some kind of nightmare, a figment of my overactive mind. But even now, I can't explain it. I still don't know who that man was or why the car followed me so relentlessly. The only thing I know for certain is that someone was out there, and I'm not sure if it was ever really gone. I haven't gone back to those woods since that day. But every time I drive past the entrance, I see the shadows moving in the trees, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still waiting there, in the dark, flickering just beyond the reach of the light. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend escape, a chance to unwind far away from the chaos of city life. A remote cabin by the lake, surrounded by nothing but nature, seemed like the perfect retreat. I was excited about the idea of being alone with my thoughts, fishing during the day, and enjoying the peace and quiet of the woods at night. Little did I know that silence would soon be shattered in ways I couldn't explain. The cabin was tucked away in a secluded part of the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was small but cozy, and the view of the lake from the porch was breathtaking. The water was still, reflecting the deep blue sky and the looming trees around it. I arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked my things, and immediately took a walk down to the water's edge. The place was as serene as I'd hoped, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of distant birds breaking the stillness. It felt like the perfect place to relax. As evening approached, I lit a small fire in the wood stove inside the cabin, settling in for the night. I was just beginning to read when I heard it, the first scream. At first, I thought it was just a distant animal, maybe a fox or a coyote. But as the sound echoed across the still lake, I realized it was something else. It wasn't an animal. It was a human scream, sharp, desperate, and filled with terror. It seemed to come from across the lake, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough that it sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, straining to hear, but the forest was eerily silent again, as if nothing had happened. I assumed it was my mind playing tricks, the isolation getting to me. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe someone else had rented a cabin nearby and was just having a late-night argument, I reasoned. But then, about an hour later, I heard it again. This time, the scream was even closer, closer than before. It was a long, drawn-out wail, like someone in extreme pain, followed by frantic gasps for air. My heart began to race. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was in distress. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, looking out over the water. The night had become thick with fog, and the lake looked like a vast, black mirror. The scream was unmistakable now, echoing off the water, but I couldn't see a thing. The fog was too thick. I strained my eyes, feeling the rising panic as I thought about the possibility that someone could be hurt or worse. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of life anywhere around. It felt as though I was the only person for miles, and the idea that someone was out there, alone and in pain, sent a wave of dread through me. I hesitated, unsure whether to venture out to the lake. What if it was just some weird trick of the mind? What if it was some kind of prank or just an animal making an eerie sound? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and the flashlight and headed for the shoreline. The closer I got to the water, the more the air seemed to thicken, like it was pressing in on me. The screams were now clearer, but also more distorted, like they were coming from beneath the water itself. I was standing at the water's edge, trembling, when I saw it. A figure, a shadow, moved on the far side of the lake, just at the edge of my sight. I could only make out the vague outline of someone stumbling or dragging themselves along the shore. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were moving erratically, and they were clearly in distress. I called out, hoping for some kind of response, but the figure didn't acknowledge me. I was too far to help, and something told me it was better not to approach. But my fear got the best of me, and before I could think rationally, I started walking along the shore toward the figure. As I stepped closer, the air grew colder. The scream started up again, but this time it was more of a shrill, guttural wail, a sound that made my skin crawl. It felt wrong. So wrong. The closer I got to the water, the more it felt like the lake itself was alive, like it was drawing me and pulling me toward the figure on the shore. I finally reached a small dock, the wooden planks creaking underfoot as I made my way toward the water. The shadowy figure was still there, but now they were still, standing motionless by the lake. I couldn't make out any details except for the shape of a person, tall, thin, and unnervingly still. The scream died away, replaced by a silence that felt like it was suffocating me. Something inside me snapped, and I turned to leave. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing there, motionless, watching me. It was as though they were waiting for me to leave, waiting for something. I had no idea what that something was, but I had no intention of finding out. As I hurried back to the cabin, the air felt colder, almost frozen. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows darker. My mind raced with fear, each step feeling like it took longer than the last. When I reached the cabin, I bolted the door behind me. But even inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The lake was still, the fog thickening, and the scream had stopped. But I couldn't rid myself of the image of the figure by the shore. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened terror, unable to sleep. I kept hearing things, soft scraping sounds against the cabin walls, faint whispers in the wind, footsteps in the distance. But I didn't dare go outside again. I couldn't. The next morning, I gathered my things and left. I couldn't shake the unease, the feeling that something had been waiting for me in those woods, and it wasn't done with me yet. When I passed the lake, it was still covered in fog, the water as still as glass. But I couldn't help but feel that it was hiding something, something that would never leave me. I've never gone back to that cabin. And every time I think of it, I hear the scream again, echoing across the water. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.